Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It was an impulsive decision. A weekend getaway to a secluded old estate my friends and I stumbled upon online. The photos painted a picture of grandeur, a sprawling mansion surrounded by acres of overgrown gardens and towering trees. Though it had clearly been abandoned for decades, something about it called to us. The price was cheap and the reviews were sparse, but we didn't care. We were drawn by the mystery. The drive out was long, winding through remote country roads until we finally reached the estate. The mansion stood tall, its windows shattered and ivy climbing up the brick walls. The front gate, rusted and nearly falling off its hinges, groaned as we pushed it open. A sense of unease settled over us, but we brushed it off as part of the adventure. Inside, the house was dark and musty. The wooden floors creaked beneath our feet, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. Cobwebs hung from the chandeliers and dust coated every surface. Yet, we were excited to explore, until night fell. As we settled into the grand dining room, the house seemed to shift. The warmth from the fireplace barely touched the chill that seeped into the walls. The shadows moved on their own, stretching unnaturally across the room. Whispers started again, soft, indistinct murmurs that came from nowhere. They weren't clear words, just a series of fragmented sounds, as if someone was speaking in tongues. "Stop it," Rachel said, laughing, nervously. "It's just the house settling." But it wasn't. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw them. Shadows, figures emerging from the darkness. At first, they were barely distinguishable, distorted. Outlines of people standing still, their features obscured. The more we focused, the clearer they became. Smiling faces with hollow eyes, mouths gaping open in silent screams. "Turn on the lights," James shouted, panic setting in, but the bulbs flickered and died the moment we attempted to turn them on. Only the fire remained, casting a flickering glow that only made the shadows seem more alive. "Let's get out of here," I yelled, trying to push past the others toward the front door. But the front hall was filled with more shadows now, standing like statues in every doorway. Their faces twisted into grotesque smiles, and their eyes glowed with a faint, otherworldly light. "Don't let them get us," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Suddenly, one of the figures moved, a slow, deliberate step forward. We froze, terror gripping us. Its form began to take shape, no longer just a shadow. It was a woman, her long dress tattered, her face obscured by strands of matted hair. Her fingers stretched out like claws, reaching toward us. "We're trapped," Rachel cried, backing against the wall. The house felt alive, every creak, every whisper vibrating through the air. "Run!" James screamed, shoving past me. We darted through the maze of rooms, the shadows snapping at our heels. The whispers intensified, echoing louder, louder, until they became a deafening roar in our heads. Somehow, we made it to the grand staircase, our only escape route. The front door was closed, blocked by an overwhelming darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. At the top of the stairs, another figure stood. A man this time, gaunt and emaciated, his eyes completely hollow. He raised a hand, beckoning us closer with a twisted grin. "Jump!" I shouted. We leapt over the railing, landing in a heap on the marble floor below. The shadows surged upward, following us relentlessly, their screams engulfing the air. Through the broken front doors, we burst into the night, gasping for breath. The mansion was silent again. The figures vanished, the whispers fading to nothing. We collapsed on the lawn, the moonlight illuminating our shaking forms. As we stumbled away, we didn't look back. The mansion stood dark and still, an endless abyss of forgotten horrors. It started as a simple hike through the woods. a group of friends looking for a peaceful weekend away from city life. We stumbled across an overgrown trail, winding deep into the forest. The path eventually led us to an old, crumbling well. The stone structure was nearly hidden by ivy and moss, and a rusty metal handle hung beside it, creaking softly with every breeze. "There's something weird about this place," Lauren said, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. The sun had begun to set, casting long, dark shadows through the trees. "It's just a well," Jake shrugged. "Probably just some forgotten thing from the past." But none of us could shake the unease. The air around the well felt heavier, more oppressive, as if the very ground we stood on was alive with something ancient. Even the birds had fallen silent, their chirps replaced by a hollow stillness. "We should go," Emma whispered, glancing at the others. "I don't like this." "I agree," Alex said quickly. "Something feels wrong." Yet, against our better judgment, curiosity got the better of us. Jake leaned down toward the well's edge, peering into the black depths below. "It's just a hole," he said, smirking. "Nothing creepy about it." We gathered around, shining, flashlights into the dark shaft. Nothing but shadows stared back. Suddenly, Lauren gasped. "Wait, do you see that?" "What?" I asked, though I couldn't see anything but the inky blackness. "There's something down there. It moved. Probably just your imagination," Jake said dismissively, turning away. But Lauren wouldn't let it go. "It was a face," she insisted. "A pale face, watching us." That night, the campfire crackled and popped, but the unease lingered. We kept glancing at the well, even though none of us wanted to go near it again. The wind picked up, howling softly through the trees, making every shadow seem more sinister. As darkness fully descended, strange noises began to emerge from the woods. Whispers at first, then distant sobbing. The wind carried the sound closer, growing louder with every passing moment. "Stop," Emma said, her voice trembling. "Please, just stop." But the whispers didn't stop. They circled us, moving with the wind, speaking in a language none of us understood. Lauren clutched her arms, her face pale as fear overtook her. Then we heard it. A voice, low and guttural, whispering directly into our ears. "You should have left." Jake jumped to his feet, swinging his flashlight wildly. "Who's there?" His voice cracked, filled with terror. The darkness seemed to pulse in response, a menacing, oppressive force closing in on us. Suddenly, the ground shook. The well trembled beneath our feet, the rusted handle swinging violently. From the depths, a low, guttural growl echoed upward, deeper than any human voice could produce. "Run!" Alex screamed, grabbing Emma and pulling her away. The others followed closely behind, tripping over roots and scrambling to escape. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of our cars parked at the edge of the trail. The well stood in the distance, unmoving, shrouded in darkness. Not a sound came from it anymore. But even after we had driven away, the whispers still followed. Us. Every night since, we hear them. Soft, distant, haunting. "You should have left." It was a quiet, misty afternoon when my friends and I stumbled upon the garden. We had taken a detour from our hiking trip, looking for a peaceful spot to rest. The garden was hidden away, its entrance obscured by overgrown hedges and vines that clawed at the crumbling stone walls. It looked abandoned, yet there was something strange about it. A heavy silence, almost oppressive, that seemed to press down on us as soon as we stepped through the iron gate. The air was thick with the scent of decay. Flowers bloomed wildly in neglected beds, with colors that were eerily vibrant against the fading light. The usual buzz of insects was absent, replaced by an unnatural stillness. The trees lining the garden seemed to shiver in the breeze, their twisted branches gnarled and skeletal. We wandered deeper into the maze-like garden, making our way toward a crumbling fountain at the center. Every step forward felt like wading through a dream. a dream where something watched from the shadows, something ancient and cruel. The whispers started as soft rustles in the leaves, then morphed into voices, faint yet insistent, repeating, words that seemed to echo through my very soul. Leave. Leave now. The voices sounded like they were speaking directly into my mind, twisting my thoughts into knots. My friends tried to brush it off as an optical illusion, but I knew better. There was something here, something more than just a forgotten garden. Suddenly, the sun dipped lower, painting the garden in shades of gray. Shadows stretched longer, twisting into grotesque shapes that danced between the crumbling paths. The air grew colder despite the warmth of the day. "Let's get out of here," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling, but the garden didn't want us to leave. The paths twisted unpredictably, leading us deeper into the maze. Each step we took felt heavier, the oppressive silence thickening around us. "Which way?" Mia asked, looking around desperately. I tried to focus, searching for the gate we had entered through, but it had vanished. The walls that surrounded the garden seemed to shift, forming new pathways, leading us toward the center where the fountain stood. At the fountain, there was no water, only a cracked stone basin filled with black, stagnant liquid. The whispers grew louder here, as though the very stones were speaking to us. "I've had enough," I said, my voice breaking. "We have to get out." But Lucas and Mia couldn't hear me anymore. They were lost in their own thoughts, their eyes glazed, over as though they were sleepwalking. The garden had taken hold of them, binding them to its madness. "Snap out of it!" I screamed, but it was like they couldn't hear me. They moved toward the fountain, their hands reaching for the dark water. In that moment, I saw her, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to gaze right through me. She emerged from the shadows, stepping delicately among the stone tiles. Her form twisted unnaturally, her feet barely brushing the ground as if she floated. Her presence was suffocating, draining every ounce of sanity from the air around her. Who are you?" I stammered, backing away. "Leave," she whispered, her voice hollow yet menacing. "Leave, or join them." I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat as her icy gaze pierced my soul. The whispers grew unbearable, louder and more twisted. My vision blurred, the garden collapsing into a swirling vortex of darkness. Then, everything went black. When I awoke, I was lying on the edge of the forest, far from the garden. The mist had lifted, leaving me alone in the silence of the trees. My friends were gone, vanished as if they had never been there. The garden, it had consumed them. And every night since, I hear the whispers still calling me back. It was a late afternoon when my friends and I stumbled upon the meadow. We had been driving through the countryside, seeking a quiet place to camp for the night. The sun was setting behind a thick veil of clouds, casting the landscape in shades of gray and gold. Off the beaten path, we found a small dirt road leading into an overgrown field, a place we assumed no one had visited in years. The meadow was expansive, surrounded by dense woods on all sides. Wildflowers bloomed sporadically, their colors, dull and faded, blending into the tall grass that swayed gently in the breeze. It felt peaceful at first, almost serene. But something didn't sit right. As we set up camp near the center, the silence pressed in on us. The occasional rustling of leaves from the distant woods was the only sound, but it seemed too deliberate, too unnatural. The air was thick, heavy, and somehow cold, even though the temperature was warm for late summer. "Let's get the fire going," Alex suggested, trying to break the tension. His voice echoed softly into the stillness. We gathered wood and started, building a small blaze, but it flickered unnaturally, as though hesitant to light. Shadows danced along the edges, moving more than the fire itself. That's when we heard it. A soft, indistinct whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't loud enough to make out words, just the faintest murmur. like the rustling of breath behind us. We exchanged uneasy glances. "Did you hear that?" Sam asked quietly, lowering her voice as if speaking louder would draw attention. "Hear what?" I replied, though I already knew. The whisper had been real. We fell into an uneasy silence, our focus shifting between the fire and the darkening woods. The whispers continued, though now they felt closer, more distinct. They shifted from incomprehensible murmurs to something almost human, faint voices speaking, laughing, though they never formed clear words. Suddenly, the fire went out. The embers sank into ash as if extinguished by an unseen force. We sat in total darkness. The only sound, the steady rustling of grass, louder now, more invasive. "Something's not right," Alex murmured, his voice trembling. "That's putting it lightly," I replied, feeling a chill run down my spine. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Shadows slithering across the perimeter of the firelight, shifting just out of reach. They weren't animals. No creature moved like that. No natural form bent and twisted in such unnatural ways. "Stay close," Sam whispered, her voice trembling. "Just stay close." The whispers became louder, clearer. They weren't just disembodied sounds anymore. They spoke to us now, voices overlapping and rising in volume. "Leave, leave, leave," they chanted, echoing from the woods and around the edges of the meadow. Panic set in. We gathered our things hastily, bumping into one another in the dark. The once familiar world seemed foreign, twisted in the shadows. The whispers grew louder, forming a crescendo, an endless, maddening symphony of voices all around us. We bolted toward the car, our feet pounding on the uneven ground. Behind us, the meadow disappeared into a void, the whispers swallowing everything. When we reached the car, the door slammed shut on its own, locking us inside. Breathless, we sat in the confined space, staring through the windshield into the nothingness beyond. The field had vanished, just an empty void stretched in its place. The whispers subsided, leaving only the silence once again. But we could still feel them, lingering, crawling beneath our skin. We left the meadow behind, driving into the darkness, but the whispers never left our minds. It was the dead of night when we reached the old lighthouse. The sea was wild, the waves crashing against jagged rocks below, and the wind howled through the skeletal structure of the lighthouse like a banshee. My friends and I had been road tripping along the coast when we stumbled upon the dilapidated building, an ancient beacon lost to time. The lighthouse stood tall, its once pristine white paint faded to a ghostly gray. A rusty metal staircase spiraled up to the lantern room, now broken and hollow. There was no power, no light, just the sound of the sea, roaring endlessly in the distance. "Why are we even here?" Alex asked nervously, the cold biting through his jacket. "Because it's cool," Mark replied, smirking. "Come on, man. You scared?" "Just something feels off," Alex muttered, glancing around the dark grounds. The area was overgrown, weeds tangled in the cracks of the cobblestone path. The only source of light was a small flashlight, flickering intermittently. "AE." We moved closer. The wind picked up again and the shadows seemed to pulse with movement. There were no lights, but it felt like we weren't truly alone. Footsteps echoed in the distance, soft, steady, as if someone else were pacing the grounds. "Who the hell is out here?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her grip on her phone tightened as she scanned the darkness for any sign of movement. "It's just us, right?" "I don't see anyone," I replied, scanning the area with my own flashlight. But there was nothing, only darkness. The air grew colder as we climbed the staircase. Each step groaned beneath our weight, metal straining against rust. The higher we went, the more the wind howled, the sound pressing in on us from all sides. It felt as though we were ascending into some ancient, forgotten realm. When we reached the top, the lantern room was empty. The lens was shattered, glass shards glinting in the faint flashlight beams. The wind howled through the space, sending shivers down our spines. But something else caught my attention. A faint, rhythmic tapping against the cold stone walls. It wasn't the wind. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, his voice tight. I nodded, uneasy. "Yeah, something's here." Suddenly, the lights flickered, briefly illuminating the room before plunging us back into darkness. The tapping intensified, now almost a scratching sound. It echoed like a heartbeat, steady and measured, coming from deep within the stone. A figure appeared in the shadows, just a faint silhouette, one that seemed to move impossibly fast. "Emma," gasped as the flashlight flickered again. This time, the figure was closer, the darkness itself writhing and shifting around it. I could barely make out its shape. Tall, with gaunt features and hollow eyes, its form distorted as though bending. "Reality itself! Run!" I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by the wind. We bolted down the staircase, but the creature followed, its presence oppressive and all-consuming. The metal groaned beneath our feet, but it felt like nothing could outrun it. When we finally made it to the ground, we didn't stop. We sprinted across the grounds, through the overgrown grass, and didn't dare look back. The creature's whispers cut through the wind, words too twisted to understand, yet they left a chill deeper than any ice. We found the car, slammed the doors shut, and peeled out, leaving the lighthouse behind. The sea calmed as we sped away, the wind dying down, but the memory of those hollow eyes, those whispers, haunted us long after we drove away. It was late afternoon when we stumbled upon the meadow. We were deep into the forest, following an old overgrown trail we had found by chance. The sun barely broke through the thick canopy above, casting long shifting shadows on the forest floor. Everything was peaceful. Too peaceful. The meadow appeared suddenly, almost as if it had been hidden by the trees themselves. A vast, open space filled with wildflowers and tall, swaying grass. The air was heavy, laced with the scent of damp, earth and the faintest hint of something floral, but not quite natural. There was a stillness that was almost oppressive. "We should set up camp here," Jake said, breaking the silence. His voice felt too loud, echoing unnaturally in the vast space. "No," Emily said, her voice a whisper. "Something's wrong with this place." We didn't listen. The meadow was too beautiful to ignore. We spread out our gear, setting up, our tents near the edge of the trees. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Shadows lengthened, and the peace of the afternoon gave way to something colder, more unsettling. As night fell, the meadow transformed. The air grew colder, and the once peaceful hum of nature faded into a dead silence. We sat around the fire, but none of us spoke much. The quiet was too heavy, too dense. "I swear," Jake said, breaking the silence again, "I keep hearing whispers." "No," Emily said, shaking her head. "Not whispers. More like breathing. Like something is right behind me." I turned, scanning the meadow beyond the firelight. The darkness swallowed everything, leaving only silhouettes of tall grass and swaying wildflowers. Nothing moved, no wind, no rustling leaves. Yet the feeling of being watched pressed down on us like a vice. Suddenly, the campfire flickered, sending shadows dancing wildly across the tents and trees. The shadows moved unnaturally, no breeze to guide them. They twisted and stretched, taking forms that were impossible to explain. I could swear I saw faces in them. Cold, hollow faces. That seemed to peer from the edges of the light. Emily screamed, "They're coming closer!" We leapt to our feet, hearts racing, but it was impossible to outrun the shadows. They slithered across the ground, creeping towards us from all directions. The whispers returned, louder now, accompanied by guttural, inhuman sounds, a chorus of agony and hunger. "Get back!" Jake yelled, but his voice was drowned by the rising chaos. Shadows wrapped around him, pulling him into the darkness. He clawed at the air, screaming as his figure was swallowed whole. "No!" I cried, grabbing Emily's arm as we stumbled backward, but the shadows had already reached her. She fought, pushing at the inky tendrils that coiled around her, but her screams were cut short. I couldn't breathe. The cold seeped into my bones and the whispers filled my head. Alone. Forever alone. The meadow had consumed them all. I was the last to fall. When I woke, the meadow was still. The fire had burned out, leaving only ashes behind. The tents were gone. There was nothing but the silence of an empty, forgotten space where no one else would ever return. It was just after sunset when we arrived at the old house. Its crumbling facade was cloaked in ivy, windows boarded up with rotting wood, and the yard out front overrun with weeds. We didn't know much about it, only that it had been abandoned, for decades, whispered about in local legends and supposedly haunted by the gardener who had gone mad. My friends and I had stumbled upon it during a weekend road trip. Curiosity had brought us there, and as the fading light painted everything in shades of gray, we thought it would make for a perfect setting for a night of eerie stories and laughter. We set up camp in the garden, an expansive space surrounded by tall hedges and a wrought iron fence. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the distant hum of crickets was almost drowned out by the uneasy silence. As we started a fire, the first unsettling thing happened. A shadow moved, just a flicker at the edge of the garden, just out of sight. My friend Emma noticed it first, her eyes wide. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "What?" Mark asked, brushing it off. "It's just the wind." But there was no wind. Not yet. That night we told stories, laughing nervously as the fire crackled. The moon rose higher, casting an eerie glow over the garden. I was beginning to feel uneasy, an oppressive feeling that something wasn't right. The shadows cast by the fire seemed to stretch unnaturally long, curling around us like twisted hands. Suddenly, a rustling sound emerged from the tall hedges surrounding the garden. At first, it was subtle, just a whisper of movement, but it grew louder, more purposeful. I froze, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The others noticed it too, their laughter silenced. "Is someone there?" Mark called out. His voice echoed, unnaturally loud in the stillness. No answer. The rustling became a steady creeping, the noise moving closer, deeper into the garden. My heart pounded harder with every second. The fire flickered, casting wavering shadows onto the hedge walls, and every so often I thought I saw faces in the darkness, a distorted face with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Emma's voice broke the silence. "We have to leave." But before we could act, something pressed against the fence, cold and heavy as if a hand had reached through the bars. We all backed away, startled, staring at the unmoving, dark shape on the other side of the fence. It seemed to be watching us, unmoving and silent. "Let's get out of here," I whispered urgently, grabbing my backpack. As we hurried to pack, up, a loud thud echoed through the garden, a sound that seemed to come from beneath us. The ground trembled slightly beneath our feet. We froze once again, looking at each other in panic. The fire hissed and sputtered, casting flickering shadows, as though the flames were desperate to burn something unseen. The rustling grew louder, like dozens of footsteps now surrounding us, closing in. "Run!" Mark yelled, grabbing Emma's hand and bolting toward the house. We raced toward the old front door, dodging the shadows that seemed to twist in the firelight. My breath came in sharp gasps, my legs burning with exertion. The garden behind us was alive now. Alive with something that wanted us gone. At the front porch, I twisted the doorknob. Locked. I pounded on it, screaming for someone, anyone, to help, but no one answered. We were trapped. Suddenly, the rustling stopped. The garden fell eerily silent. The shadows crept back toward the hedges, retreating into the night. A cold wind swept through the garden, sending shivers down my spine. Through the silence, I heard a voice, low and rasping, echoing through the still night air. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, close but not near. We didn't wait to find out what else it would say. We ran, leaving the garden behind, never looking back. It was an old place, nestled deep in the woods. My friends and I had come across it completely by accident during a hike, an ancient, twisted tree standing alone in the heart of the forest. Its gnarled roots seemed to claw at the earth, and its branches spread wide like skeletal fingers. The locals had always spoken of the tree in hushed tones, warning about its dark history, but we dismissed their tales as simple campfire stories. The tree wasn't just any tree. Its bark was riddled with strange symbols, carved so deep they looked like they had been there for centuries. At the base of the trunk, someone had built a small altar. Worn stones, faded flowers, and candles long melted into the ground. In the center, a single, rusted dagger was plunged into the dirt. "Let's leave," Alex whispered, his voice tense. "Something feels off." But I was drawn to it. There was a strange allure, a sense of unease that was almost impossible to resist. I traced my fingers over the carvings, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the ancient wood. "That dagger," I said softly. "What if someone made a wish?" Matt snorted, shaking his head. "Wishing trees are myths, dude. It's just an old, creepy tree. Let's get out of here before it gets dark." We had turned to leave when I saw it. The first whisper of movement. A shadow, flickering in the corner of my vision. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, but then it became clearer. A figure standing under the tree, obscured by the shadows of its branches. "Wait," I called, stopping in my tracks. The others turned back toward me, confusion evident on their faces. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. "Did you see that?" I asked breathlessly, heart pounding. "No," Alex said, shaking his head. "Saw nothing." Still, the feeling lingered. The oppressive sense that we weren't alone. The whispers returned, softer this time, winding through the air like smoke. We left the woods quickly, deciding to set up camp far from the tree. Yet, even as we distanced ourselves, the unease remained. That night, I woke to the sound of something moving just beyond the tent. It wasn't the wind. There was no breeze, and the rustling was deliberate, almost too quiet to hear. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, but the shadows seemed alive, slithering just beyond the edge of its light. "Stop it," I hissed into the dark, forcing myself to calm down. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. The whispers returned louder, more urgent. Each word echoed in my mind, promises of power, desires granted, but at a price. The dagger, was it meant for sacrifice? In the dead of night, I heard a voice. It was soft, low, and impossibly close. "You can have what you desire. Just give me something in return." I couldn't scream, couldn't move. The figure was back under the tree, but this time it was closer. Its features were indistinct, just a shadow, hovering in the darkness. Its voice came from nowhere, but it filled my thoughts entirely. "Make your wish," it murmured. "Tell me what you want." Terror clutched my chest. I was frozen, paralyzed by the thought of what could happen if I spoke. What had others given in exchange for their desires? And could I really trust anything this ancient force promised? As the figure moved forward, the boundary between reality and nightmare blurred. The others were still asleep, unaware of the horror unfolding just feet from our tent. "Leave," I whispered, my voice shaking, but the figure only smiled, a smile devoid of any warmth, any humanity. "No one leaves," it said, its voice hollow. At dawn, the figure was gone. The tree stood alone once again, as though nothing had happened. My friends woke up to find me pale, trembling, unable to explain what I had seen. I never went back to that place, and every time I pass through the forest, I make sure to take a different trail. The wishing tree remains in my memory, a haunting, eternal warning. It started as a simple renovation project. We were fixing up an old farmhouse we had recently purchased. The house had character, creaky wooden floors, antique fixtures, and a sprawling, overgrown yard. But beneath the charm lay something unsettling. The basement was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten memories. The wooden stairs creaked as we descended, the sound echoing unnaturally loud. My flashlight barely cut through the oppressive darkness, and the faint hum of the old flickering bulbs above did little to illuminate the space. Boxes lined the walls, some filled with forgotten family heirlooms, others with items that hadn't been touched in decades. The deeper we went, the colder it became, until a shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't the kind of cold you feel when exposed to the elements. It was something more unnatural, something that settled in your bones. Then, in the farthest corner, we found it, a wooden door, unmarked, almost hidden by the layers of dust and cobwebs. The handle was rusted, nearly falling off when I touched it. My curiosity got the better of me. With a hesitant push, the door creaked open. Beyond was a room we hadn't expected, a strange, sterile space that felt disconnected from the rest of the basement. The walls were lined with old medical equipment, iron examination tables, forgotten, syringes, and cabinets filled with jars of specimens preserved in formaldehyde. It looked more like a clinic from another era, abandoned and untouched by time. "That can't be right," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. My flashlight flickered, once more casting unsettling shadows against the walls. The glass containers held twisted, lifeless shapes. A malformed fetus, misshapen limbs, and something that looked far too human. The specimens seemed to pulse ever so slightly, like they were breathing, their glassy eyes reflecting back at us. "Let's get out of here," I urged, but as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the basement, trapping us in darkness. Whispers filled the air, soft, guttural voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Stay," they hissed. "Stay." Fear gripped us, our breaths coming in short, gasps as the air grew colder still. My flashlight was useless now, its beam barely illuminating the faint outlines of the grotesque figures in the jars. The whispers grew louder, morphing into something menacing, a chorus of voices, distorted and pleading. Suddenly, the medical equipment around us began to move. Tables shaking, cabinets sliding open on their own, and the jars tilting as if something unseen was shifting inside them. The specimens writhed, their features twisting into unnatural forms. I could barely scream as I felt something brush against my hand, a cold, bony finger wrapping around mine. In that moment, the voices screamed, inside my head, "You shouldn't have come here." The room dissolved into madness and darkness consumed everything. It had been years since anyone had lived in the grand old estate. The once stately mansion sat at the edge of a wooded hill, its windows dark and its gates rusted shut. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, whispers of the family who had vanished, without a trace decades ago. Curious, my friends and I decided to explore it. As we parked our car along the long winding driveway, the sun was setting fast. Shadows stretched across the lawn, and the silence was unsettling. No birds, no breeze. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. We approached the mansion cautiously, stepping over overgrown weeds and broken cobblestones. Inside, the house was a mausoleum of forgotten memories. Dust coated every surface and the scent of decay was overwhelming. Furniture had been pushed aside or torn apart, revealing splintered wood and faded fabrics. The grand chandelier above us hung precariously, its crystals cracked and reflecting warped shadows. "Be careful," I warned as we navigated the dark hallways, but the others were too mesmerized by the beauty of the place to heed my words. In the ballroom, the floorboards creaked beneath our feet, sounding louder than they should have. A broken mirror leaned against the far wall, reflecting an empty space where a figure shouldn't have been. Yet, when I glanced back, I swear I saw a distorted face, its eyes hollow and sunken, watching us from the reflection. I turned away quickly, dismissing it as a trick of the dim light. We continued deeper, searching for signs of anything left behind. At the far end of the hall, we stumbled upon a locked door, its wood old and warped with age. There was something unsettling about it, like the very air around it was heavier. As I touched the doorknob, a chill ran down my spine. Before I could turn it, a voice whispered from behind us. "You shouldn't be here." We froze, turning slowly. The hallway was empty, no footsteps, no breathing. Just the echo of the voice lingering in the oppressive silence. I reached for my flashlight, but it flickered weakly, only illuminating the darkness further. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. The weight in the air pressed, heavier, a suffocating presence looming over us. "Let's get out," someone whispered. As we turned toward the main entrance, a sound echoed down the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps, as if something impossibly tall was walking toward us. My heart pounded. The whispers grew louder again, no longer a voice, but a chorus of whispers, filling the room with ancient, inhuman murmurs. We bolted for the door, but it was locked. Panic set in. The whispers rose into guttural chants, filling the space with something dark, something long forgotten. Finally, with one final scream, the door burst open, revealing nothing but empty moonlight. The estate stood behind us, silent once more. We ran to the car, not daring to look back. The mansion was gone by the time we glanced over our shoulders. The snow fell heavy and fast as we made our way up the winding mountain road. My friends and I had rented a remote cabin deep in the woods, a place untouched by modern life, surrounded by towering pines and endless white. The sun had already set, leaving the landscape bathed in an eerie, blue-tinted glow. As we arrived, the storm intensified. The wind howled through the trees, whipping snow into violent gusts that obscured the path behind us. The cabin stood alone, a weathered wooden structure that creaked with each blast of wind. There was no signal, no power, just silence and isolation. Inside, the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, and we settled in. We laughed, unpacking supplies and sharing stories of the strange legends surrounding the cabin. Locals had warned us to stay alert. Strange things happen in those woods, they said. Of course, we dismissed them as just old tales meant to. Scare tourists. That night, as the storm raged outside, something woke me. I wasn't sure what it was, maybe the howling wind or the sudden stillness that followed. I sat up, the room dimly lit by the flickering fire. My friends slept soundly, their breathing even and steady. But something wasn't right. A faint tapping echoed through the cabin. Soft, rhythmic, like fingers against a window pane. It wasn't the wind. It came from the front door. I froze. My pulse quickened. The storm outside drowned any sound of movement, but the tapping grew louder, as if whoever, or whatever, was there, was trying to get in. I slowly reached for my phone, hoping for a signal, but it was dead. I could hear nothing but the storm. My breath fogged in the cold air as I stood frozen, listening. The tapping stopped. Silence again, except for the distant creaks of the cabin settling into the storm's embrace. Then, a voice, low and distorted, whispered, "My name." It was close, too close. I backed away from the door, heart racing. My mind screamed to wake the others, but fear kept me rooted. The firelight flickered, casting long, shifting shadows that danced across the walls. The door handle began to turn slowly, not enough to fully open, but enough that I could hear the faint scrape of metal against wood. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Let me in." "No," I whispered back, shaking. I stumbled back to the corner of the room, too terrified to move. Outside, the storm raged on, but the tapping grew frantic. The whispers morphed into quiet, guttural murmurs, murmurs that seemed to come from within the very walls of the cabin. They seemed to echo inside my head, louder with each passing moment. Suddenly, the power flickered on briefly, just for a second, but long enough for me to see. The figure. It stood just beyond the window, half obscured by the falling snow. Its face was hollow. No features, just an inky void where a face should be. But its eyes, they glowed faintly, pale and cold. The scream ripped from my throat as the fire went out, plunging us into darkness once more. I could hear the others stirring, confused, but the figure was already inside, its voice closer now, a sinister whisper in my ear. "You shouldn't have come." It was an old farmhouse, sitting far from any modern conveniences. My family had moved in after the previous owner passed away, and the house had been untouched for years. The place had its charm: antique furniture, wooden floors, and that strange, musty smell. But something about the basement unsettled me from the start. The door to the cellar was small, barely noticeable at the base of the staircase. It was hidden under a thin rug and secured with a rusted metal latch. My father would sometimes go down there to retrieve canned goods or check the water pump, but he always insisted it wasn't worth exploring further. "Nothing down there, but old junk," he'd say with a dismissive wave. But curiosity got the better of me. One rainy evening, when the house creaked with every gust of wind, I decided to investigate. The cellar was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. Rows of wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of preserved vegetables and dusty tools from decades ago. In the corner stood a wooden chair, nothing special really, except it seemed out of place. The air was damp, heavy, and the silence was almost suffocating. Every time the wind blew, it whistled through unseen cracks, creating a haunting, rhythmic sound. That's when I noticed something strange. Near the far end of the cellar, beyond the shelves, there was another door. One I had never seen before. It was painted black, its edges worn as if dragged through the earth itself. It had no handle, no visible lock, only a faint impression as though it had been designed to blend in with the stone wall. I walked toward it slowly, my breath fogging in the cold air. Something felt wrong. The closer I got, the harder it became to move. My limbs felt heavy, like I was walking through water. Suddenly, the bulb above flickered out entirely, plunging the cellar into darkness. A low whispering began, voices, distant and indistinct, brushing against my ears. They spoke words I couldn't quite hear, and yet I knew they weren't benign. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely audible. The whispering stopped. I reached out toward the black door, my fingers brushing against the cool surface. There was a texture, as though the door wasn't wood at all, but something far more ancient and unnatural. I pushed against it, though it didn't budge. It felt as if it wasn't meant to be opened, meant to remain hidden forever. I backed away slowly, the whispering beginning again, but louder this time. The voices weren't just speaking anymore. They were chanting, low and rhythmic, as if a chant rising from deep within the earth itself. The temperature dropped rapidly, and an oppressive weight settled on my chest. The air grew thick with something otherworldly. Panic gripped me. I reached blindly for my flashlight, turning it, on just in time to see the black door shift. It didn't move outward. It shifted inward, melting into the wall as if swallowing itself, And then, it wasn't a door anymore. It was a void that stretched endlessly into darkness, shifting and writhing like a living thing. The whispering grew louder, morphing into a chorus of voices, some crying, some laughing, each sound hauntingly, familiar, yet alien. My breath hitched, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Suddenly, a voice cut through the noise, a low, guttural whisper right in my ear. "You should have left it alone," I screamed as the void surged toward me, pulling me into the darkness. It was just another forgotten warehouse, hidden away in the industrial part of town. Rusted metal walls, shattered windows, and a reputation for being haunted by whispers. Nothing unusual for a place like this. I was a paranormal investigator, drawn by the stories of strange occurrences that had plagued the building for years. My team, 4 of us, stepped inside, armed with cameras, EMF meters, and a thirst for the truth. The building had a heavy, oppressive atmosphere from the moment we entered. Dust motes floated through the dim light, settling into layers on the floor like some forgotten graveyard. The floorboards groaned beneath our steps, and every sound amplified unnaturally. The whispers, we were told, had only gotten louder over time. Murmurs of lost souls trapped within the walls. "Stay close," I warned, my voice steady despite the unease creeping into my chest. The air was thick with moisture, colder than it should have been for a building left unused. The rusted machinery in the far corner creaked faintly, as if it were alive, its wheels turning for no one. We moved deeper into the warehouse. The farther we went, the more things felt off. Our equipment buzzed erratically, EMF readings spiking randomly and the cameras capturing flashes of movement that weren't there when we reviewed the footage later. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder. Soft, agonizing voices chanting in unison, echoing from the shadows. The sound was unsettling, though no matter how much we tried to make sense of it, no clear words emerged, just fragmented syllables, endless and haunting. "Who are you?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling. She was the newest member of the team, and clearly the most affected by the overwhelming atmosphere. But there was no response, just more whispers. Louder this time, closer. I shone my flashlight down a corridor, revealing a door ajar at the end, pulsating with faint, unnatural light. It wasn't our equipment malfunctioning. This light radiated from the shadows as if something inside was calling out to us. "Let's check it," I said cautiously, motioning for the group to follow. The air grew colder with each step toward the doorway. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a choir of sorrowful voices clawing their way into our minds. The light pulsated brighter, too bright, and the moment we crossed the threshold, the temperature plummeted further. Inside, the room was unlike anything we'd encountered. Bookshelves lined the walls, but they were empty, barren wood with nothing to show. The center of the room held a circular stone table, ancient symbols etched into its surface, glowing faintly beneath the strange light. Around the table stood figures, shadowy, human-like shapes with no faces, just voids where eyes should be. They turned toward us as one, their murmuring voices intensifying. It was impossible to make out what they were saying, but their presence was overwhelming. Every instinct screamed at us to run, but our bodies felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking, reaching for the camera. One of the shadow figures stepped closer. It didn't have feet, just tendrils of darkness curling from where they should have been. A breath escaped from the void where its face should have been, whispering directly into my ear. "Bound," it whispered, "bound to this place." Then everything went black. The amusement park was once the heart of the town. Bright lights, laughter, and the sounds of roller coasters echoing into the night. Now it was a shell of its former self, an abandoned wasteland of decaying rides and rusted metal. My friends, and I decided to explore it late one evening. The thrill of sneaking into a place that was supposed to be off limits too tempting to resist. The entrance gates were wide open, the rusted hinges creaking as we pushed them aside. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the faint scent of mold clinging to the wooden structures. The silence was eerie, broken only by the distant hum of the city fading into the distance. We wandered through the park, the familiar sights distorted in their abandonment. The carousel stood still, its horses frozen mid-gallop, the painted faces hollow and lifeless. The Ferris wheel, once a towering attraction, now loomed above us, its metal frame leaning dangerously with a low, ominous groan. "There's something off about this place," Emma said, her voice shaking. "It's too quiet." "I know," Jake whispered, looking over his shoulder nervously. "Let's just get out of here." But we couldn't leave yet. The allure of the forgotten amusement park pulled us deeper. We ventured past the decaying snack stands and ghostly game booths, their prize shelves empty and cobwebbed. The further we went, the darker it became, with only the faint glow of dying street lamps to guide us. The more we explored, the more unsettling things became. Every step felt heavier, the air colder. And then we saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the Ferris wheel, its silhouette dark against the fading lights of the city beyond. It was too tall, too thin, its shape twisted unnaturally. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. It didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, watching. The silence stretched unbearably long. We stared at the figure frozen in place, the weight of the moment pressed down on us, suffocating. Then the figure raised a hand, a long, slender hand, and pointed toward the roller coaster. "No," Jake whispered. "We shouldn't." But something compelled us. The figure was beckoning, its motion slow and deliberate. We couldn't resist. We followed the shadow toward the skeletal remains of the roller coaster. Halfway through the ride, we stopped. Below us was a mess of twisted metal and broken tracks. The train cars had long since rotted away, left hanging eerily in the air. The entire structure groaned in protest, the sound of rust scraping against rust filling the silence. "We need to go back," Emma insisted. "Now!" But as we turned to leave, we heard a voice, a whisper, just behind us. "Why don't you stay?" I spun around. The figure was closer now, no longer just a silhouette. Its twisted form hovered above the ground, its face obscured in shadows. It was the embodiment of wrongness, a distorted, elongated being that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. "Run!" Jake shouted. We bolted, our footsteps pounding against the crumbling pavement. The figure followed effortlessly, its elongated strides covering the distance between us impossibly fast. The ground shook beneath its weight, the shattered rides shaking with each heavy step. We ducked into the ghostly funhouse, desperate to find a hiding spot. Inside, the warped mirrors reflected unsettling images. Faces twisted into screams, bodies shifting grotesquely. Emma let out a scream, her voice piercing the air, but it only seemed to anger whatever was chasing us. The hallways stretched impossibly, the walls closing in. The whispers became screams, louder and louder until we couldn't tell where they were coming from. The distortion of reality was overwhelming, a nightmare given form. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the screams stopped. The funhouse went silent. We crouched in the darkness, too afraid to move. And that's when we heard it. The laughter. Soft, high-pitched giggles echoing from somewhere deep within the building. The laughter grew louder, echoing off the warped walls. It was coming closer. "Wake up!" Jake whispered frantically, shaking me. "It's a nightmare. Wake up!" But it wasn't a nightmare. It was real, and it wasn't letting us go. It had always been a dream of mine to visit the old lighthouse perched on the edge of the coast. Lonely and secluded, it stood tall against the crashing waves, weathered by time and the elements. No one had lived there for decades, and the stories surrounding it were enough to keep tourists away. Whispers of strange sounds, shadows moving in the corners of windows, and eerie lights flickering from the tower at night. I had heard those stories, but curiosity won out over fear. With nothing but my camera and a notebook, I set out alone to capture the lighthouse. The journey was long and treacherous, the winding coastal roads cutting through cliffs that seemed to scrape the sky. By the time I reached the lighthouse, the sun was sinking below the horizon, leaving the sky in a wash of muted colors. The building loomed over me, massive and imposing. Rusted metal stairs spiraled up the side, disappearing into the top of the tower. I knew there was no electricity, no phone signal, and no one for miles. The isolation was absolute. Still, I was eager to explore. Inside, the air was damp and cool. Old furniture, faded and broken, littered the main room. The walls were lined with photographs and journals, evidence that someone had once called this place home. Dust coated everything, settling like a veil over the long-forgotten memories. Flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I made my way to the staircase. Each step creaked underfoot, the sound echoing down the empty halls. Shadows stretched endlessly in every direction. The higher I climbed, the colder it became, the wind whipping through the open windows. The top of the lighthouse was a narrow room, filled with metal machinery and a glass lens that once guided ships safely through the night. The light had long since died, but the memory of it still hung in the air, a strange, almost tangible presence. I began taking photographs, capturing the decay, the emptiness. The silence was oppressive, the kind of silence that seems to hum just beyond the ears, a constant, subtle pressure against the senses. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice a whisper in the vast emptiness. There was no response, just the wind outside, battering the lighthouse like a living thing. But the sensation only grew stronger, as though something was watching me, just beyond the edge of sight. I glanced around, camera ready, but there was nothing. Still, I kept snapping photos. The lens flared once, casting an eerie glow in the dark. Looking through the viewfinder, I saw something, a pale face in the corner of the frame. It wasn't there in reality, only in the photograph. A ghastly figure, eyes hollow and mouth slack, peering out from the shadows. I froze, unable to move. Shaking, I snapped another shot, but the face wasn't there anymore. It was gone, as if it had never existed. I checked the photos in disbelief, but each one was empty, just the desolate interior of the lighthouse. My breath quickened. Suddenly, a voice echoed softly in the distance, carried on the wind. "Stay." I spun around. "Who's there?" Silence. But that voice, so close, so clear, lingered in my mind like a haunting melody. I looked out the windows, scanning the coastline. Nothing but waves crashing against the rocks and the infinite horizon. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I felt exposed, trapped by the vast emptiness. My flashlight flickered again, dying for a moment before flickering back to life. It seemed weaker now, the beam wavering as if struggling against something unseen. I stumbled down the stairs, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. The lower levels were darker, more enclosed. The wind howled through the windows, but it wasn't enough to drown out the whispers that grew louder with each step. "Leave," the voice whispered again, closer this time. A breath in my ear, I raced toward the door, fumbling with the rusted handle. My flashlight shut off entirely, plunging the lighthouse into complete darkness. Panic surged through me. I heard footsteps, bare, ragged footsteps, on the wooden floor below. They echoed louder and louder, as though whatever was chasing me was right behind me. "Stay with me," the voice said again, this time more insistent, more menacing. With all my strength, I kicked the door open, stumbling into the night. The heaty sea breeze hit me like a wave, cold and bracing, pushing the whispers away. I ran toward the car, away from the lighthouse. As I sped down the coast, the images flashed through my mind, the face in the photograph, the voice, the footsteps, and I knew. I knew the lighthouse was alive, a place too long abandoned, too tied to something unnatural, something that had never truly left. To this day, I never returned. The lighthouse still stands there, solitary and quiet, but I can't. Forget the shadows that reside within it. Some places I've learned should never be explored. It was supposed to be a simple job. I'd been hired to take care of a woman's elderly uncle, Mr. Mallory, for the weekend. The family had gone out of town and they wanted someone to check on him, keep him company, and make sure he took his medication. He lived alone in a sprawling old mansion that had been in his family for generations, perched on a cliffside overlooking the ocean. The place was remote, isolated, the kind of house you'd expect to see in horror movies. I didn't mind. I needed the money. Mr. Mallory was pleasant enough, slow-moving, frail, but with a sharp mind. He lived in the parlor most of the time, sitting by the window and staring out at the sea. He'd occasionally speak to me, but most of the time, he preferred the silence. It was eerie, but I chalked it up to his age. The first evening, after dinner, he asked me to close the heavy curtains in the parlor. It was getting dark, and he didn't like the view of the ocean at night. "Too many things out there," he muttered cryptically, his hand shaking as he handed me the curtain rope. I thought little of it. It was just a man's preference. I finished, closing the curtains, and the room seemed to shrink in the dim light, making it feel even more isolated. Mr. Mallory had retreated to his chair, staring vacantly at the floor. "Don't mind the house, dear," he said without looking up. "It has its secrets, and some of them are still here." I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I brushed it off. Old people often said strange things. The night passed uneventfully, though I found it difficult to sleep in the house. The wind howled outside, and the sound of creaking floorboards in the halls kept me on edge. At around 2 a.m., I was awoken by a noise, a soft scraping sound coming from downstairs. I held my breath. It came again, louder this time. A faint dragging, like something heavy moving across the floor. I hesitated, but decided to investigate. I tiptoed down the dark staircase, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. As I reached the bottom, the noise stopped. My flashlight flickered as I shone it into the hallway. Nothing. Just empty rooms, their doors ajar. I took a few cautious steps forward. Then I saw it. A shadow, barely visible, moving from one room to the next at the far end of the hallway. I froze. The shadow didn't belong to anyone I knew. It was too tall, too thin, and it moved with an unnatural fluidity. I called out, "Hello, Mr. Mallory?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even seem to hear me. Slowly, I crept closer, my heart hammering in my chest. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. Mr. Mallory stood there, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "Don't follow it," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's been watching me for years." Before I could ask what he meant, the shadow moved again, disappearing into one of the rooms. I felt the blood drain from my face. I turned to Mr. Mallory. "Who is it? What is that thing?" His voice cracked. "You don't want to know. Stay upstairs. Stay out of its reach. It's waiting." I didn't need to be told twice. I rushed back up to the parlor, locking the door behind me. My pulse was racing, and my hands were clammy. What was that thing? Why didn't Mr. Mallory seem shocked? The night dragged on in silence. The next morning, Mr. Mallory seemed calm, almost normal. He was sitting in his chair again, staring out the window at the churning sea. I wanted to ask him more about last night, but he simply looked at me and said, "You don't want to know." When the family returned later that afternoon, everything seemed fine. too fine. The house was silent, the air still. They were surprised to find Mr. Mallory in good spirits, talking about the weather. Nothing unusual. I mentioned the strange occurrences, but they dismissed it with a laugh. "He's getting on in years," they said. "Sometimes his mind plays tricks on him." But I wasn't convinced. As I left the house that evening, I glanced back at the dark windows of the mansion. And there, at the top floor, I saw it. A shadow. A figure standing perfectly still, staring down at me. Its face was pale, twisted, empty, just like Mr. Mallory had described. I couldn't explain what it was, but as I drove away, I realized the terrifying truth. The figure in the window hadn't been watching Mr. Mallory all these years. It had been watching me. It was an old house, one that had been abandoned for years. My friends and I had been dared to spend the night, and while I was skeptical, the allure of a night of horror was too much to resist. The house had been sealed shut for decades, with a heavy padlock barring the attic door at the top of the stairs. The main level was covered in dust, the floorboards creaking beneath our feet with every step. Old furniture sat in disrepair, and the air was thick with decay. We laughed at the cliché, at the creaks and whispers that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. But when we reached the top of the stairs, things shifted. The attic door loomed. Before us, solid wood, locked shut with a rusted chain. It looked more like a tomb than a storage space. "We don't have to open it," Sam said, uneasy. "Let's just go home." "Come on," I urged. "There's nothing up there." With a shaky breath, I took hold of the chain. The padlock was rusted, nearly falling apart as I tugged. After a few tense moments, it gave way with a loud snap. The door swung open with a slow creak, revealing darkness beyond. A single flashlight flickered on. We hesitated at the entrance, peering inside. It was a vast, windowless space, filled with cobwebs and stacks of forgotten boxes. The air was colder up here, and something about it felt wrong. "Hello," I called, though my voice barely pierced the silence. No response, just the sound of our breathing and the distant creak of the wooden floor. As we moved deeper into the attic, I snapped photos with my camera. The flash illuminated strange shapes, blurred figures and faces in the corners of the photos that weren't visible to the naked eye. Every image came out distorted, like there were things just beyond our sight, watching. The deeper we ventured, the heavier the atmosphere became. My flashlight flickered again, dying for a moment before reigniting. Sam's camera stopped recording, mid-shot, only to glitch and display corrupted footage, distorted faces, whispering figures, shapes moving just out of reach. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence, a soft, agonized whisper coming from the shadows. "Leave. Leave," it hissed. A voice so faint it seemed to originate from within my own mind. I spun around, heart racing. "Did you hear that?" "Stop it," Sam hissed, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of here," Emma said, her voice a terrified whisper. But just as we began to retreat, the door behind us slammed shut, locked again by unseen hands. The air became frigid, icy cold, creeping into our bones. Shadows crept along the floor, slithering toward us from the corners of the room. The whispers intensified, becoming more distinct, more malevolent. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The walls seemed to close in. My flashlight flickered again, illuminating a figure. Just a glimpse, a fleeting shadow in the corner of the room. It was faceless, but its form was grotesque, hunched and shifting. Its fingers were elongated, reaching toward us like claws. "Get back!" Sam yelled, grabbing Emma's hand. We stumbled toward the entrance, but it was futile. The figure loomed closer, its movements unnatural, its presence oppressive. Through the distorted photos on my camera, I saw it again. Hundreds of figures, hundreds of faces, twisting and writhing beyond comprehension. They weren't human. They never had been. I screamed as the flashlight went out completely. Darkness enveloped us and the whispers turned into deafening screams. The sound of footsteps, not ours, echoed louder and louder with every second. A hand brushed against my shoulder, cold, icy, and real. My breath caught. I couldn't move. In the last moment, I heard the voice again, clearer now. You should have left the attic closed. It started with a simple invitation, a remote retreat in the mountains. My friend Sam had stumbled upon an old, secluded villa nestled high in the peaks. The idea was to escape the noise of the city, unwind in a place untouched by modern life. Sam had promised us peace, solitude, and breathtaking views. The villa was hidden away, accessible only via a winding, treacherous road that spiraled up the mountainside. When we finally reached the top, the place looked as though it had been forgotten by time. The grand structure was centuries old, its faded exterior barely visible through the thick fog that had rolled in. Large, ivy-covered windows glared like hollow eyes watching as we approached. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The furniture was old and moth-eaten, and cobwebs clung to every corner. There were no modern amenities, no Wi-Fi, no cell signal. It felt like we had stepped into a different era entirely. But we brushed it off, thinking of it as part of the charm. That night, as we sat around the fireplace, the silence became oppressive. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. It was peaceful at first, but then something changed. We started hearing faint whispers, soft murmurs carried by the wind. They were too quiet to make out, but they seemed to be coming from the hallways, from behind the closed doors. Each time we opened a door to investigate, there was nothing but emptiness. We joked that it was just the old house settling, but the whispering only grew louder. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Maybe our minds were playing tricks on us. But the next night, the whispers became more distinct. They weren't just murmurs. They were voices, muffled, distorted, like they were speaking a language we couldn't understand. The voices seemed to come from every direction, sometimes whispering in unison, other times fragmented and disjointed. Sam went to bed early, exhausted. From the long drive, leaving me and Emma to stay up by the fire, we tried to ignore the unsettling sound, but it was impossible. The whispers filled the entire house, echoing through the hallways. I swear I could feel them breathing down my neck. Then, at some point, the whispers changed. They began speaking, my name. Soft, almost loving, the way someone might whisper to a child in the dark. I froze, the chill of fear racing up my spine. Emma heard it too, her face pale and trembling as she clung to my arm. We moved closer to each other, but the voices grew louder. Not just my name, but others. Names I didn't recognize. They seemed to be coming from the other side of a door, at the end of the hall, the only door that remained locked. "Do you hear that?" Emma whispered, her voice shaking. I nodded, my heart thudding in my chest. The whispers didn't stop. They echoed endlessly until we couldn't ignore them anymore. Finally, driven by a mixture of terror and morbid curiosity, I approached the door. My hand trembled as I placed it on the knob, turned it slowly, and pushed. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. The whispers came from below. They seemed to beckon us, urging us to follow. My legs felt frozen, but Emma grabbed my hand and tugged me forward. We couldn't fight the pull. As we descended, the air grew colder. The whispers became clearer, more insistent. I could now make out fragments. "Come to us," they whispered. "We've been waiting." At the bottom, we found ourselves in a long, dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with portraits, faces with hollow eyes that seemed to follow us as we walked. The whispers grew louder, more desperate. Suddenly, the corridor opened up into a vast, ancient hall. It was like something out of a nightmare. rows of long wooden tables covered in rotting food and dust. At the far end, we saw figures seated in shadows, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They didn't move, but the whispers seemed to come from them, filling the room like a chorus. The moment we stepped into the hall, the whispers ceased. The air grew still, suffocating. The figures remained seated, their heads bowed. We stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. Then, one by one, they raised their heads, their hollow eyes fixed on us. In that instant, I knew. The whispers had been them, waiting. The last thing I saw were those empty, lifeless eyes staring straight at me as we ran back up the stairs, the whispers echoing once more behind us. We made it out of the villa, but we didn't speak of what we saw. The memories haunt us still, the echoes of those whispers following us wherever we go. Something followed us from that place, something that remains in the shadows, waiting, always waiting. It started with an invitation I couldn't ignore. A friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, reached out. The message was simple. "Come visit me. I've got something strange to show you." His house was located high on a hill, far from any main road, surrounded by empty fields and scattered woods. I hadn't seen him in over a decade, but the tone in his message felt urgent. Intrigued, I agreed. The drive there took hours. The farther I went, the fewer signs of life I encountered. The last mile was on a narrow, winding road that disappeared into thick forest on either side. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under my tires and the rustling of leaves. Finally, I arrived at the house. It stood on a hill, distant and isolated, looking more like a relic from another time than a modern home. The windows were old, the wooden shutters peeling, and the paint was faded and cracked. Yet there was something unsettling about the place, the silence, the emptiness that seemed unnatural. As I stepped out of my car, a chill ran down my spine. The air was thick, as though something had been pressing down on the world for too long. The only movement came from the trees swaying gently in the wind. But something felt off. My friend met me at the door, his face pale, his eyes sunken. He had always been the quiet type, but this was different. He looked weary, as if he had been through something I couldn't fathom. "You made it," he said, barely looking at me. His voice was hollow. I followed him inside. The house was quiet, almost oppressively so. The wooden floor creaked underfoot, and every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far. The air smelled old, like dust and decay. It wasn't simply abandoned. It felt trapped, as though the house itself hadn't aged well. He led me upstairs, past rooms that were cluttered but untouched. There was a tension in his silence that was almost deafening. When we reached the attic door, he hesitated before opening it. "I've never told anyone about this," he muttered, his hand shaking as he pulled the door open. "I've tried to forget." The attic was filled with boxes, old furniture covered in sheets, and the lingering smell of something long forgotten. But it wasn't the mess that caught my attention. It was the overwhelming silence, the kind of silence that felt deliberate, oppressive. He moved toward one of the boxes and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. Its cover was cracked, and the pages yellowed with age. He handed it to me without a word. "What is this?" I asked, flipping through the fragile pages. "I don't know," he replied. "It was here when I moved in. I've never been able to read it. Something about it feels wrong." The pages were filled with strange symbols. None I recognized. The handwriting was uneven, as if whoever had written it wasn't fully in control. I could feel the weight of it in my hands, as though the book had a life of its own. I handed it back to him, but as he took it, his grip tightened. His knuckles went white and he looked up at me with a mixture of fear and resignation. "There's something else," he said quietly. "I've heard things. At night, in the walls." I stared at him, unsure whether to believe him, but his eyes betrayed the truth. "We all hear things," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whispers. Voices. They don't stop." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "That's just the house settling, right?" He shook his head, his face pale. "It's not the house, it's something else." That night, as I lay in the guest room, I couldn't sleep. The house creaked, but it wasn't just the sound of wood settling. The whispers began again, soft, barely audible at first, but as the hours passed, they grew louder. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block them out. They were coming, from the walls, the ceiling, and every corner of the house. "You're not supposed to be here," a voice whispered, hollow and distorted. "You shouldn't be here." I couldn't escape it. No matter where I moved, the whispers followed. The next morning, my friend was gone. His car was still parked outside, but he wasn't answering his phone. I searched the house, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. I left the house, leaving the door wide open behind me, and never looked back. The woods swallowed the road, and I drove away without a second glance. I never went back, and I never will. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything beyond what my eyes could see. Not until that night. It was just a normal evening when my friends and I decided to go hiking. We had heard about a hidden trail deep in the nearby forest, far from any roads, or signs of civilization. The air was crisp, the trees towered above us, their shadows stretching long and eerie as we followed the winding path. It was supposed to be a quiet escape, a peaceful night beneath the stars. The trail was narrow, barely more than a dirt path with thick forest on either side. The sunlight dimmed fast, leaving only the soft glow from our flashlights to guide us. We didn't talk much, just walking, listening to the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle in the bushes. It was when we reached a clearing that things started to feel wrong. The atmosphere shifted. The forest was no longer the familiar, welcoming place it once was. The trees seemed taller, their branches forming a canopy that seemed to trap the light, casting deep shadows. The air grew colder, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We decided to set up camp there, thinking it was a good place to rest. But the longer we stayed, the more uneasy I became. The silence was deafening, as though the forest was holding its breath. I glanced around, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, but the woods felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. That's when I heard it. A faint, distant whisper. A voice, barely audible, carried on the wind. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. "Did you hear that?" I asked my friends, but they shook their heads, too preoccupied with setting up the tents. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as night fell, the whispers grew louder, weaving through the trees like they were calling to me. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, the darkness growing thicker. Then, in the stillness, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A shadow, taller than any tree, motionless. I couldn't make out its features, just a black silhouette, watching us. My heart pounded, and I called out to my friends, but they didn't see it. I took a step toward the figure, compelled, despite the fear gripping me. As I drew closer, I noticed something strange. The figure didn't cast a shadow. The very ground beneath it seemed to bend around the shape, as though the light avoided it. It wasn't human. It was more like a void, a gap in reality. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't look away. I was frozen, watching as the figure tilted, its head almost as if acknowledging my presence. Then the whispers became a voice, calm but cold. "You shouldn't be here." I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The figure took a slow step forward, and I took a step back, realizing there was no escape. The whispers turned to screams in my head, but still, I couldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The forest returned to its usual silence, but something had shifted. The unease lingered, heavier now, almost suffocating. My friends, oblivious to what had just happened, continued setting up camp, blissfully unaware. I never told them about the figure, about the whispers that still echo in my mind, and I never went back to those woods. To this day, I wonder if whatever I saw is still waiting. It was the kind of summer evening where the air feels thick, almost suffocating. My friends and I decided to take a drive out to the old abandoned amusement park that was rumored to be haunted. The place had been closed for decades, forgotten, overgrown, and left to rot. We weren't really sure what we expected to find, but the idea of exploring something so eerie felt like the perfect escape from the humdrum of our usual lives. As we parked near the entrance, the silence was oppressive. The old, rusted gates groaned as we pushed them open, the metal scraping against itself. The ground was uneven beneath our feet, with weeds and tall grass creeping up through the cracks in the concrete. It felt as though time had stopped. We walked through the overgrown pathways, stepping carefully to avoid the broken glass and twisted remnants of rides that once filled this place with laughter. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its rusted frame creaking in the faint breeze. We weren't exactly sure what we were hoping to find, but the air was thick with a strange tension that made my skin crawl. As we ventured deeper into the park, the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Shadows stretched long and distorted, casting unsettling shapes on the decaying attractions. The further we went, the quieter it became. The sounds of birds and wind seemed to fade away, leaving only the echo of our own footsteps against the cracked pavement. Then came the first sign that something wasn't right. We came across the old carousel. The once bright-painted horses were now faded and covered in moss. We stopped in front of it, the air suddenly feeling colder. I could see my breath in the dim light. Something felt off. I had this overwhelming sensation that we weren't alone. Noticed a strange figure standing by the far side of the carousel, just beyond the broken tracks. It was tall, too tall, with a gaunt, skeletal frame that seemed unnaturally elongated. The figure didn't move, just stood there, facing us with its head tilted at an impossible angle. "Guys," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Look." They turned, following my gaze. At first, they didn't see it, but when they did, they froze. The figure stood still, its hollow black eyes staring at us. There was no face, just a void where its features should have been. It didn't blink, didn't even seem to breathe. "Let's get out of here," someone said, their voice shaking. We turned to run, but as we did, there was a sudden, sharp sound behind us. The slow creak of the carousel. I dared to look back, and there it was, moving. The horses spun, but there was no sound, just the grotesque image of the figure standing there, watching us. We ran, pushing through the undergrowth, desperate to get back to the car. The park seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees closing in around us. Every time I looked back, I could see the figure, always there, always watching. When we finally stumbled out onto the road, we didn't stop running until we reached town. The park faded, behind us, swallowed by darkness. To this day, I don't know what we saw, but whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. It was just another evening walk through the woods, like countless others I'd taken before. My friends and I had made a habit of these late-night strolls, always curious about what lay beyond the edge of town. The woods were familiar to us, comforting even, filled with tall trees and the rustling of leaves. But that night was different. We set out just after dusk, the golden glow of the sunset fading behind us. The air was cool, crisp, and the distant sounds of traffic seemed to fade away as we ventured deeper into the trees. The woods were quiet, too quiet. There was no laughter, no chirping of crickets, just silence. It wasn't the usual peaceful quiet, though. It felt wrong. We walked on, joking and laughing, trying to shake off the oppressive atmosphere, but something was off, something I couldn't quite place. My friends seemed oblivious, lost in their chatter, but I felt the weight of the forest pressing down on me. As we pushed further, we came across an old, decaying wooden bench, rotted and covered in moss. It wasn't there on our previous walks, that much I was sure of. We decided to stop for a moment, stretching our legs, as if the bench had appeared there just for us. I sat down, resting my hands on my knees. The silence felt heavier now. I looked around, but there was no sign of the familiar paths we usually walked. The trees felt tighter, as if the woods were closing in. My stomach twisted. "I think we should head back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. One of my friends, Jake, waved me off. "Come on, what's the rush? We've been here a dozen times, there's nothing different." But I wasn't so sure. Something wasn't right. We continued walking, though my steps grew slower. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, and the usual landmarks, the twisted old tree, the hollowed-out log, were nowhere to be found. It was as if the forest had shifted, or we had. Then came the first sound that shattered the silence, a faint echoing whisper that seemed to drift through the trees. It was so soft I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But then, there it was again, a whisper, distant yet near, as though it was calling to me. I stopped, heart racing. My friends turned to look at me, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Hear what?" one of them replied, their tone dismissive. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. "Never mind, let's just keep going." We pressed on, but the whispers grew louder, closer. They weren't coming from any one direction. They seemed to drift around us as if carried by the very trees themselves. The shadows deepened, casting the woods in an eerie glow. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the trees, pale and gaunt, its features obscured by the fading light. At first, I thought it was one of my friends playing a trick. But this figure didn't walk like a person. Its movements were unnatural, jerky and slow, as though it didn't belong to the world we knew. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure turned its hollow gaze towards me. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were dark and empty, like voids of nothingness. "Run," I managed to whisper. But before I could move, my friends stood frozen, transfixed by the figure. I screamed at them to move, but they didn't respond. They were still, staring at the figure like they couldn't look away. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, and I could feel something shift in the air around me. The figure stepped closer, its movements like something out of a nightmare. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest, but my feet wouldn't move as if the ground itself was holding me in place. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed something. The trees weren't trees anymore. They were faces. Hundreds, thousands of hollow, empty faces staring back at me from the darkness. Their mouths were open, whispering, calling out in that haunting, otherworldly language. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel its presence pressing against my skin, colder than anything I had ever known. Its breath was a chill, a void of nothingness that seemed to consume everything around me. I could hear my friends murmuring, lost in the whispers of the forest, their eyes wide but unseeing. I was alone now, standing amidst the forest that had become a sea of emptiness, the faces of the trees watching me, waiting. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispers filled my ears, louder and louder, until they became all I could hear. And then there was silence. I never expected a simple road trip with friends to turn into something so terrifying. It was meant to be a weekend getaway, a drive to an old abandoned lighthouse by the coast, miles from civilization. We thought it'd be fun, something adventurous, but that trip is burned into my memory forever. We left in the early afternoon, 4 of us packed into a beat-up car, the windows rolled down as we blasted music and laughed. The drive was long and uneventful, winding through the countryside with only the occasional stretch of trees and empty fields. By the time we arrived at the old lighthouse, the sun was already setting, casting everything in a soft, eerie glow. The lighthouse stood tall and weathered, its windows dark and shattered. It had been abandoned for decades, locals avoiding it after countless stories of strange sightings and disappearances. But we were young and naive, more interested in the thrill of exploring something unknown. We made our way up the worn, steep staircase that led to the top of the lighthouse. The wind howled through the cracked windows, and the sounds of the ocean crashing against the cliffs below echoed around us. The view from the top was breathtaking, until I noticed something in the distance. At first, I wasn't sure what I was seeing. A figure, distant, barely visible against the darkening sky. It stood there, unmoving, watching us. My stomach sank. I nudged my friend, whispering, but before I could say anything, the figure turned and vanished behind the cliffs. We tried to brush it off, convincing ourselves it was just our imagination, or maybe someone else exploring the area. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me. The wind picked up again, louder now, like something was urging us to leave. We returned to the car and headed back, the drive back feeling longer and more oppressive than the one there. The fields and trees seemed to loom, shadows stretching unnaturally across the road. It wasn't until we were a few miles down the winding path that things started to get strange. The radio crackled to life, static filling the air. We all froze. There was no signal out here, no reason for it to be on. I reached out to turn it off, but the sound didn't stop. The static continued, shifting into something more than noise, a voice. At first, I couldn't make out what it was saying. It was muffled, distorted, like something trapped in the wires. But then I heard it clearer. Turn back. The voice was cold, hollow, and deep. My friends were frozen, staring at me. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. It repeated again, louder this time. Turn back. You shouldn't be here. The car began to shake, as if the very road was trembling beneath us. I wanted to scream, to pull over, but the car wasn't responding. It just kept moving, as if something was forcing us forward. We reached a stretch of road where the trees thickened, blocking out the sky. The shadows became heavier, darker. I could barely make out the road anymore. Then I saw it. Those figures again standing by the side of the road just out of sight. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They were watching us. The voice returned, louder, more frantic now. Turn back. I slammed on the brakes, but it was no use. The car continued, the trees closing in around us. I could hear the whispers now, indistinct but growing louder. I felt a cold, oppressive pressure bearing down on me. Let us go, I whispered, my voice shaking. But no one answered. The figures grew closer, their shadows blending into the dark. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the car stopped. The engine sputtered and died, leaving us in silence. The static on the radio faded, and the world felt still, as if everything had paused, waiting. We didn't move. We couldn't. I stared out into the blackness, my friends motionless beside me. The figures were gone, but the whisper of the voice echoed in my head. Turn back. It was a summer evening, and I decided to take a walk through the old neighborhood park. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown trails. I had lived in this town my entire life, but I had always avoided this park, partly because it had a reputation, mostly forgotten now, of being haunted or unsettling. People used to talk about strange noises, whispers, and figures moving through the trees, but I never paid much attention to those stories. That night, though, I needed some quiet, some space to clear my head. The park wasn't far from my home, just a short walk away. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, where the old oaks loomed over the trails and the air smelled thick with the scent of pine and earth. As I strolled down the main path, the woods on either side seemed darker than I remembered, the trees taller and more imposing. The usual sounds of the city were distant now, just the rustle of leaves and the faint hum of insects. The silence was unnerving, almost oppressive. I had a strange feeling, as though the forest itself was watching, waiting for something. I continued walking, my footsteps crunching softly against the gravel path. I passed by an old wooden bench, splintered and half-rotted, its paint chipped and faded. It had been there forever, the kind of thing no one really paid attention to anymore. But something about it caught my eye. A faint scratch, almost too faint to notice, ran down the bench's surface. The marks looked as if they'd been made by long, sharp claws. I paused for a moment, staring at the bench, my heart thudding harder. It couldn't have been anything natural. No animal could have left such clean, precise scratches. Maybe kids had vandalized it, but the deeper I looked, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness, as though those marks weren't meant to be there at all. I shook off the unease and kept walking, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I ventured further into the park, I noticed something strange. The trees weren't swaying with the breeze like they should have been. Instead, the branches hung motionless, as if the wind itself had vanished. Then came the sound. A low, raspy whisper carried by the stillness. It came from behind me, soft and indistinct, as though it had traveled from far away. I stopped, listening, but the whisper faded before I could make out any words. My stomach twisted into knots, and I forced myself to keep walking, faster now, as though I could outrun whatever had made that sound. As I turned a bend in the path, I saw something ahead, a figure partially obscured by the thick trees. It wasn't moving, just standing there, silhouetted against the last light of the setting sun. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't look human. Its outline was too tall, too lanky, with limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Shadows seemed to crawl along its body, swallowing it whole. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the longer I stared, the more I felt something stir inside me. A primal fear I couldn't explain. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't shift or move. It simply stood there, watching me. I forced myself to look away, to keep walking. But as I passed, I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unrelenting. I clenched my fists, willing my legs to carry me faster. A rustling behind me snapped my attention back. I spun around, expecting to see nothing. But there it was again. The whisper, now louder, more insistent. It wasn't words, just fragments, like someone muttering in a language I didn't recognize. The figure was gone, but the trees seemed to bend toward me now, their branches brushing the path like fingers reaching out. The unease grew until it felt unbearable. I glanced down at my phone. No signal. Of course, there was nothing but static in this part of the park, and I had no way to call for help even if I wanted to. Suddenly, I heard the sound again, this time closer, closer than I'd ever imagined. It was right behind me now, following, breathing down my neck. My legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, staring into the woods, unable to tear my eyes away from the darkness that seemed to stretch forever. Who's there? I whispered, my voice cracking. No answer, just the whisper. Louder now, almost as if it was coming from inside my head. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything fell silent. The whisper, the rustling, the feeling of being watched. All of it disappeared. I didn't dare turn around. I kept walking, every step trembling beneath me. I didn't know if I was imagining it, but I could have sworn something was still there, hidden just beyond the edge of my vision. The park finally gave way to the street, and as I walked back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being followed. The whispers echoed in my ears, and I didn't dare look back. I've never gone back to the park. It was supposed to be just a quiet day in the park, like any other. My friends and I decided to visit a local nature reserve, one we had gone to several times before. The plan was simple: take a leisurely stroll through the trails, enjoy the quiet, and maybe spot some wildlife. The reserve was vast, sprawling with dense forests, winding paths, and open meadows. The air was fresh, and apart from the chirping of birds, there wasn't a sound. We had been walking for hours, soaking in the peace, taking turns spotting birds and tracking animal prints. Everything felt normal. Too normal. It was around mid-afternoon when something changed. We took a break by clearing near a small, overgrown pond. My friend Emma bent down to dip her hand into the water, running her fingers through the surface. As she did, there was a faint ripple, and she froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. We all gathered around, following her gaze. The pond looked calm, but there was something strange about it, like the reflection wasn't quite right. The surface of the water didn't ripple naturally. It shifted in unnatural ways, as if there was something beneath the surface, watching us. I had seen enough horror movies to know that something wasn't right, but I tried to push those thoughts away. "Maybe it's just the wind," I suggested, though my voice trembled. Emma shook her head. "No, that wasn't wind. It was like something moved under the water." We exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it. The park had always been peaceful. There was no history of accidents, no reports of strange occurrences. Still, that feeling of unease lingered. We decided to leave the clearing and continue down the trail, hoping to shake off the strange feeling. But as we walked further, something felt off. The trees seemed to close in around us, their shadows darker than they should have been. The birdsong had stopped entirely, and there was an eerie silence hanging over the forest. We reached a fork in the path, unsure which way to go. The map we had brought was missing, and no one remembered where we had left it. We stood there for what felt like hours, the tension growing with each passing second. It was Emma who noticed it first. Footprints. They were small, barely noticeable in the dirt, but they looked fresh. They didn't belong to any of us. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice trembling. I crouched down, inspecting the prints. They weren't human. They were long, claw-like marks, digging deep into the earth. My stomach twisted as I traced the prints, feeling their unnatural depth. "I don't like this," I muttered. "We should turn back." But none of us could bring ourselves to move. We were frozen in place, staring at the trail that seemed to go on forever. That's when we heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound, like something breathing, just beyond the trees. It was soft at first, almost indistinct, but it grew louder, more insistent. My ears strained, trying to make sense of the sound, but it wasn't like any animal I had ever heard. It was closer now, too close. "Run," Emma whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the trail, sprinting through the thick forest, our hearts pounding in our chests. The trees blurred as we moved, but no matter how fast we ran, the sound seemed to be right behind us, never fading. We came to a clearing, and that's when we saw it. It wasn't an animal or a person. It was something else entirely. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the middle of the path. Its skin was stretched tight over bone, its eyes hollow and empty. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on us, unrelenting. "We have to go," I yelled, pulling my friends along. We didn't stop running until we broke through the trees and reached the edge of the park, gasping for breath. When we looked back, there was nothing there. No footprints, no figure, only the trees swaying in the wind. To this day, we have no explanation for what we saw. The reserve was quiet once more, but something had changed. Whatever we encountered in those woods was still out there, lurking in the shadows. We've never returned to that place. I didn't believe in anything strange, spirits, haunted places, or anything that couldn't be explained by science. That is, until the night we went camping deep in the forest. It was supposed to be just a quiet weekend away from everything, but what we encountered still haunts me. We found a spot off the beaten trail, miles from the nearest campground. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird song. It felt peaceful, remote, and untouched by the outside world. We set up camp beneath towering pines, built a fire, and shared stories late into the night. It wasn't until we fell silent that I realized something was off. The usual sounds of the woods, the rustling leaves, the gentle hum of the breeze, had stopped. Completely. The night felt unnervingly still. Even my friends, usually loud and talkative, grew quiet, as though we were all waiting for something we couldn't name. Around midnight, the wind returned, but it was no longer gentle. It howled through the trees with a ferocity that seemed unnatural. The fire flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows on the forest floor. I shifted uneasily in my seat, glancing around. The shadows seemed to twist and move in ways they shouldn't. That's when we heard it, the sound of someone walking through the underbrush. Slow, deliberate steps that didn't match the sound of any animal I knew. It wasn't the crunch of leaves or the soft padding of paws. It was something heavier, more human, but not quite right. "Did you hear that?" one of my friends whispered. We all nodded, our nerves taut. I felt the cold grip of fear tightening around my chest. "Maybe it's an animal," I offered weakly, though none of us truly believed it. The footsteps grew louder, circling our camp. They came from all directions, and it didn't take long to realize whoever, or whatever, was moving wasn't trying to hide. They wanted us to hear. I stood up, heart racing. "Let's get out of here," I urged, but my legs felt like lead, unwilling to move. My friends followed my gaze as we watched shadows creep closer through the underbrush. Then it happened. From the trees, something emerged. Something that wasn't human, but not quite a creature either. It was tall, far too tall for any person, with limbs that bent unnaturally and skin that seemed to ripple like water. Its face was smooth, almost featureless, except for two black, hollow eyes that gleamed in the firelight. "Run," someone whispered, and we all turned to flee. But the figure didn't move like we did. It glided silently through the trees, faster than we could ever hope to outrun it. We could hear it, feel its presence as though it was right behind us, always just a step away. We made it back to the car, slammed the doors shut, locked them, and peeled away from the woods as fast as we could. None of us spoke. We couldn't. The image of that thing, its endless eyes watching us from the shadows, was burned into my mind. Even now, years later, I can still feel its gaze. I don't know what it was, or why it followed us. All I know is that sometimes, some places leave scars deeper than memory. It started with a simple evening trip. Just me and my partner, leaving the city behind for a quiet night under the stars. We had packed a cooler, a few blankets, and our hiking gear. The plan was to find a secluded spot, away from the noise, to enjoy the night sky. We drove out of town, into the rolling hills, the familiar sights of the city fading behind us. The roads became narrower, winding through forests, the trees towering overhead, blocking out the last of the fading light. By the time we reached a clearing by a small lake, the sun had vanished, leaving us in complete darkness. The spot was perfect. No light pollution, just the stillness of nature. We set up our tent near the water's edge, ate some snacks, and stretched out on our blankets, gazing at the sky. It was peaceful, serene. For a while, we didn't say much, just soaking in the quiet. Around midnight, we decided to take a walk along the shore. The lake was calm, almost like a mirror reflecting the stars above. I felt a sense of tranquility, the kind you only get when you're far from everything. But as we walked, something felt off. The night seemed to stretch out longer than it should have. We could hear nothing, no animals, no rustling leaves, not even the usual sounds of insects. It was too quiet. We stopped, staring out at the lake. The water was black as ink, undisturbed. That's when I noticed it. A figure. It was standing by the water, its shape indistinct against the dark. I called out to my partner, but the words caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, watching. I couldn't make out any details, but the feeling of wrongness was overwhelming. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It stayed perfectly still, just watching. The silence stretched, unbearable now. I wanted to look away, to turn back to the tent, but my feet wouldn't move. My partner, sensing my unease, grabbed my hand and pulled me, whispering, "Let's go." We hurried back to the tent, but as we reached it, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing. The lake and the woods were still and lifeless. We tried to convince ourselves it was just our imagination. Maybe it was a deer or some reflection playing tricks on us. We locked ourselves in the tent and lay there, my heart racing. At some point, I dozed off, but I woke suddenly. It wasn't the sound of footsteps that stirred me. It was the sense of someone watching. I peeked out of the tent, heart pounding, and saw the figure again just a few feet away from the tent. It was closer now, still motionless, still watching. I could feel its presence, an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. Then, without warning, the figure turned and walked into the darkness, fading into the trees. The silence was deafening again except for the sound of my breath, shallow and trembling. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, everything was gone. No figure, no eerie presence. Just the quiet lake, the trees, and the silence. We packed up quickly, leaving before the sun rose. I haven't been back to that spot since. I don't know what we saw, but I know one thing for sure. The woods are still out there, waiting. It was a quiet night when I found myself wandering through the dimly lit corridors of an old museum. The place had been closed to the public for months, but someone, somehow, had managed to gain access. I wasn't supposed to be there, but curiosity got the better of me. I'd always loved the idea of exploring abandoned places, especially ones as mysterious and ancient as this museum. The building itself was massive, filled with towering exhibits of relics from long-lost civilizations. The flickering overhead lights cast eerie shadows that stretched along the cracked marble floors, creating an unsettling atmosphere. The air smelled of dust and age, like the very walls were holding on to secrets they didn't want to let go of. As I walked deeper into the museum, my footsteps echoed louder than I'd expected. It was too quiet, almost as if the place had swallowed any sound that dared to linger. I wandered aimlessly, passing through rooms filled with ancient artifacts that seemed to whisper of forgotten lives. The silence was deafening, and every corner I turned felt more oppressive. In one of the exhibit halls, I came across an old display case holding what looked like a cracked, worn statue. It was humanoid, but twisted, with hollow eyes and a carved expression that seemed to leer. I stood there, transfixed by its unsettling presence until a sudden creak behind me jolted me from my thoughts. I spun around, heart racing. Nothing. Still, the sound felt far too real, far too close. I decided it was time to leave, but as I made my way back toward the entrance, something caught my eye. A faint light, distant but unmistakable, flickering at the end of the hall. My first thought was someone had followed me inside, but the museum was supposed to be locked up tight. There was no way anyone could have gotten in unnoticed. My gut twisted, but I couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity. I moved closer, the silence now deafening, every footstep echoing in the vast emptiness. The closer I got to the flickering light, the more I realized it wasn't from a torch or flashlight. It came from something much older, something ancient. It wasn't warm like a fire. It was cold and spectral, flickering like a dying ember. As I neared the source, the light revealed a figure standing there, motionless and still. I froze. The figure wasn't human, or at least not entirely. Its form was hollow, distorted, long, bony limbs, skin stretched taut over bone. Its face was a hollow void, empty sockets where eyes should have been. The figure remained still, its posture rigid, yet something about it felt alive, as if it were waiting for me. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. The flickering light cast distorted shadows across the creature's gaunt, emaciated form. I took a step back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind raced. Was this some kind of display? A prop? But the figure felt far too real. "Stay back," I warned, though my voice was barely audible. The creature didn't move. It simply stood there, unmoving. The light flickered again, and in that brief moment of brightness, I saw something. A glimpse of its mouth twisting into a grotesque smile, the kind of smile that didn't belong to any living thing. I knew then that whatever this thing was, it wasn't from this world. Panic took hold, and I spun around to run, my breath hitching as I sprinted through the darkened halls, the flickering light fading behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the exit, pushing open the heavy door and stepping out into the cool night air. The museum was silent again, but I could still feel the weight of whatever I had seen. I don't know if it was a spirit, a lost soul, or something far worse. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever that thing was, it was still there, waiting in the shadows. It was a late afternoon when I found myself walking through an unfamiliar forest. The dense trees stretched endlessly, their branches arching over the narrow trail, casting long, wavering shadows that danced in the fading light. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. I wasn't supposed to be here. I'd gotten lost after taking a wrong turn while hiking alone. My phone had died hours ago, and now the sun was dipping below the horizon, leaving the forest in an unnatural twilight. My heart pounded as I tried to find a way back, but the trail seemed to have vanished, leaving only a maze of trees and endless undergrowth. As the sky darkened, a chill swept through the trees. I shivered, wishing I'd brought a jacket. The quiet was becoming suffocating, oppressive. Something about it felt wrong. The wind had stopped entirely, and the usual rustling of leaves was replaced by an eerie stillness that felt almost alive. I stumbled upon an old cabin, its roof caved in and windows broken, almost blending into the surrounding woods. It stood as if untouched by time, untouched by human life. I hesitated at the threshold, the memory of horror movies flashing in my mind. But the thought of spending the night out here, lost and alone, was worse. The interior of the cabin was dark, musty, and filled with the scent of decay. Old furniture lay scattered, rotting in the corners while cobwebs stretched from wall to wall. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. As I stepped further inside, the feeling of unease intensified, as if I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. I could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken, in the cold that seeped into my bones. My breath came out in shaky puffs as I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my nerves. I fumbled in my bag, pulling out a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dim darkness. The shadows around me writhed as I moved, forming distorted shapes on the cracked walls. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, as if someone were standing right beside me, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. My stomach twisted, and I swung the flashlight around, scanning the cabin. The only sound was the creak of the old wooden floor beneath my feet. "Who's there?" My voice trembled, echoing in the hollow space. No answer. I listened closely, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The whisper came again, but this time louder, clearer. It was a name, soft but unmistakable. Sarah. I froze. My name wasn't Sarah. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the room, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just empty, rotting furniture and the lingering darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears as I clutched the flashlight tighter, wondering if I was imagining things. Sarah. The voice was closer this time. My heart pounded as I realized it wasn't just in my head. It sounded familiar, almost like it was coming from inside my own thoughts. I stumbled toward the door, but as I reached out for the handle, I noticed something. Another whisper, fainter this time, coming from the corner of the cabin. Help. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A presence in the room, as if something was leaning over my shoulder, breathing cold air into my ear. I spun around again, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, repeating over and over again like a loop I couldn't escape. Desperate, I tore through the cabin, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but every corner was empty. Every step I took felt heavier, the air more suffocating. Then I heard it, closer than ever. A low, guttural voice right behind me. Look. I whipped around, the flashlight beam illuminating the figure. But there was nothing, only my distorted reflection on the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. My breath hitched as I realized the reflection wasn't mine. The figure in the mirror had hollow eyes, its face twisted in a sick grin, its mouth moving but no sound coming out. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. The air went cold, the forest beyond the cabin silent again. I stood there, frozen, unable to move. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I turned back toward the door. As I pushed it open and stepped out into the fading light, I could feel something behind me. The whisper had vanished, but the echo of my name still hung in the air. It wasn't over. My friends and I had been planning a hiking trip for weeks, a chance to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the quiet, untouched beauty of the mountains. We were tired of screens and the constant noise of everyday life. This would be our chance to disconnect and recharge. The trailhead was only about an hour's drive from town, and we arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was crisp, and the towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction. The trail was well worn, though not overly crowded. It was perfect. As we started the hike, the conversations flowed, and we basked in the sounds of nature, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet, the soft rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds. We decided to set up camp a few miles in, beside a stream that meandered through the forest. The spot felt isolated and peaceful, exactly what we were looking for. As we set up our tents and built a fire, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling in the underbrush. I figured it was just some wildlife, maybe a deer or a squirrel. But as the evening deepened, the sounds grew more distinct. It wasn't just the rustling anymore. There were footsteps, quiet at first, but steady, following us. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see one of my friends, but no one was there. The woods were still except for the distant hum of insects. I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to worry them, but my nerves were already fraying. Every step we took, I felt like we were being watched. The sounds of the forest, which had been so comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. It wasn't just wildlife out there anymore. By the time we made it to camp, the shadows had grown long and deep. The fire we built crackled loudly, and we huddled close, trying to keep warm. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting to see someone emerge, but nothing ever came. It wasn't until later, after we had settled in, that I noticed something strange. The footsteps, whatever was following us, they had stopped. The forest was silent once again. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It felt wrong, hollow, as though something had vanished. I woke up a few hours later, shivering. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, but the night was still warm. I stepped out of my tent, hoping some fresh air would calm me. As I stood there, looking at the quiet trees, I noticed something bizarre. The usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, were gone. The forest was completely still. Then I heard it, a soft, uneven breathing. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the dark. The breathing grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It was shallow, labored, almost as if whatever was out there was struggling to draw air. The sound wasn't far from where we had camped, but the direction was unclear. I felt like whatever was out there was looking for us, and now that it had found us, it was circling closer. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something. Those footsteps earlier, they weren't just following us. They were guiding something toward us, toward the camp. I could feel the presence growing closer. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I wake my friends? But what could I tell them? I didn't want to put them in more danger than they already were. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless shadows and the faint rustling of leaves. And then I saw it. A figure. Tall, obscured by darkness but unmistakable. Its form wasn't human. It seemed wrong, like something twisted and unnatural. It stared at me from the edge of the trees, unmoving, its hollow eyes glinting in the faint light of my flashlight. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared back, frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I could see now, the uneven, staggering gait as if it wasn't fully human. The outline of its face was blurred, almost as if it wasn't meant to be seen. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the woods. The breathing stopped. The silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. My friends never woke up. By dawn, I convinced myself that whatever it was gone. I woke them and told them we needed to leave, that I wasn't feeling well. None of them questioned it. We hiked out of the forest, and I've never gone back. I've tried to convince myself it was just fear and exhaustion, that I imagined everything. But even now, I can't forget those hollow eyes, staring from the darkness. Whatever it was, I don't believe we were alone that night. I used to visit my grandfather's house every summer when I was a kid. It was an old farmhouse, isolated, sitting at the edge of a quiet valley. My parents used to leave me there for weeks while they traveled, and I never minded. Grandpa was old and grumpy, but he told the best stories about the woods that surrounded us. The house itself wasn't much, a weathered wooden structure with creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper. Outside, there were fields of tall grass stretching endlessly, and beyond that, the forest. One evening, as I explored the woods near his house, I noticed something strange. There was an old, abandoned barn deeper into the trees, one I had never seen before. It stood isolated from the rest of the woods, its roof sagging and walls covered in ivy. It was out of place, and curiosity got the better of me. I approached the barn, my steps quiet on the grass. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. There was a faint, almost imperceptible noise, like whispers carried by the wind. I stopped, listening. The whispers seemed to be coming from inside the barn, but there was no sign of life around it. I pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the barn was dark, except for slivers of light filtering through the broken roof. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy. It smelled of decay, wood, rot, and something else I couldn't place. I could barely see, but I moved cautiously, my heartbeat quickening. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the barn, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. A tall, slender shadow that didn't quite belong. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers had grown louder, almost like they were surrounding me now. I strained to see more, but the figure remained in the shadows. Then, slowly, it moved. Not like a human, though. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if whatever this thing was didn't know how to walk properly. It tilted its head, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in its hollow eyes. The whispers intensified, growing louder, more frantic. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, the barn now filled with that oppressive silence, only broken by those relentless whispers. And then, from the shadows, I heard a voice. Help me. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human either, low and raspy, like it hadn't spoken in centuries. My legs felt like lead, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. The whispers became screams, but they were inside my head. I could feel them, clawing at my mind. The figure stepped closer, its limbs bent awkwardly as if they didn't belong to a living thing, and then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. I collapsed to the floor, unable to move or think. My heart thundered in my chest, and the barn was silent again. I sat there for what felt like hours, unsure if the fear or the silence was worse. When I finally managed to stand, I left the barn and didn't look back. The rest of the summer passed without further incident. My grandfather never mentioned the barn, and I never brought it up. To this day, I don't know what I saw, but I know one thing. It wasn't human, and it wasn't supposed to be there. I had always loved the quiet solitude of the forest. Growing up, I would spend hours walking through the trees, lost in my thoughts, letting the sounds of nature calm my mind. But that day, something felt different, off in a way I couldn't explain. It was mid-afternoon when I decided to take a long hike. The weather was perfect, warm, sunny, with only a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. I parked my car at the edge of the trailhead and started walking, following the familiar path that twisted deeper into the woods. The forest felt vast and peaceful, as it always did, but today there was a strange stillness. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just silence that seemed unnatural. After about an hour, I came to a clearing, a large, flat expanse of moss-covered ground surrounded by towering trees. I decided to stop there and rest for a while. I lay back on a bed of soft grass, staring up at the sky through the canopy of leaves. As I lay there, I noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest had stopped entirely. Not just birds, but everything. It was as if the entire world had gone silent. My heart began to pound as I sat up and looked around. The air felt heavy, like something was looming just beyond my view. I stood and started walking again, though my sense of peace was gone. The silence wasn't just unnerving. It felt wrong. I felt like something was watching me, like the forest wasn't supposed to be this quiet. My footsteps became quicker, my breathing faster. Hours seemed to pass, though I wasn't sure how much time had actually gone by. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I knew I needed to turn back, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. As I walked, I came to a narrow footbridge over a shallow creek. I hesitated before stepping onto it, the creaking wood beneath my feet making me pause. The water below was eerily still, almost too still. I looked down into the water, but there was nothing there. No fish, no movement at all. The reflection staring back at me wasn't quite right either, distorted as if the water itself was not quite real. It wasn't until I reached the other side that I realized how quiet the creek had been. There wasn't even the sound of flowing water. I shook my head, trying to push away the sense of dread that was creeping up on me. The trees seemed to close in around me as I continued walking. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing against my shoulders, the stillness pressing into my ears. It wasn't just quiet. It felt like something was missing from the world. The forest wasn't supposed to feel this way, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. I began to run, though my legs ached. My breath came in ragged gasps. The forest around me seemed to blur, the shadows twisting and shifting unnaturally. I wasn't sure if it was my fear playing tricks on me or if something was actually happening. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it. A soft, raspy whisper, closer than I expected. My legs locked up, my body frozen as I stood there in the dark, unable to move. The whisper repeated itself, louder now, closer, like someone or something was right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body refused to obey. The whisper stopped, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if the very air had grown colder. I could hear footsteps now, slow, deliberate, just behind me. I didn't dare look back. Every instinct screamed at me to move, but I stood there, trembling. It wasn't until the whisper returned, right next to my ear, that I broke free from the paralysis. I bolted down the trail, my legs moving as fast as they could carry me. The trees blurred past in a chaotic rush, my breath ragged, lungs burning. I didn't stop until I broke through the tree line and saw my car in the distance. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, but I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside, the engine roaring to life beneath me. As I drove away from the forest, I realized that I didn't know what had followed me, or why, but something had, and it still felt like it was out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting. I was on a road trip with some friends, driving through endless flatlands that stretched out like a forgotten world. It was just us. No towns, no cell service, just miles of dry, cracked earth and endless sky. We had set out from the city, heading toward some isolated national park that none of us had ever visited before. The sun had long since set by the time we realized we were lost. The GPS had been spotty from the beginning, and now, deep in the middle of nowhere, it had completely failed us. The horizon seemed to blur into itself, and the landscape looked more like a dream than reality. No lights from towns, no signs of life, just us and the desolation. As we drove, a fog rolled in, creeping along the ground like something alive. It wasn't cold, just oppressive. The air felt thick, and the quiet was unsettling. We passed what looked like old, rusted-out vehicles, abandoned long before we ever arrived. Each one was a monument to time's relentless march through this forgotten place. Suddenly, the engine sputtered, and the car came to a halt. We sat there, the silence pressing in on us. No wind, no noise, just the hum of our own anxious breathing. "It's out of gas," someone said, breaking the silence. I checked the tank. It was completely empty. The moonlight barely cut through the thick fog, casting everything in an eerie, washed-out glow. We stepped out of the car, the ground dry and cracked beneath our feet. The air was thick, almost like it pressed down on my chest. I felt a cold shiver run through me, but none of us spoke of it. We set out on foot, hoping to find some sign of life, some hint of civilization. The fog thickened as we walked, swirling around us, becoming more like a presence than a natural phenomenon. My friends began to whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something they didn't want to draw attention to. Hours passed in silence, or so it felt. The land seemed endless. The fog never lifted, and there was no relief from it. Eventually, we came across something that didn't fit. An old wooden structure, half buried by the earth, barely visible beneath the thick fog. We cautiously approached, hoping it might provide some shelter or a clue. As we drew closer, I noticed something else: footprints. They were small, almost childlike, leading away from the building and into the darkness. They didn't seem natural, as though someone had deliberately walked there. Inside the structure, we found what remained of a small, forgotten homestead. Rusted tools, cracked furniture, and old, faded photographs of people who were long gone. The air inside was cold and stale, carrying the weight of years gone by. That's when we heard the sound, the faintest whisper. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I realized my friends had stopped moving, frozen, their eyes wide with fear. It came again, more distinct this time. A voice, barely audible, calling from outside. But it wasn't like any voice I had ever heard. It was not human. It was hollow, distant, as though it came from some place beyond this world. Follow. The voice seemed to echo, twisting through the fog. My friends were visibly shaken. We had to get out of there. We had to run. But the fog was thick, blinding us to our surroundings, and the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. We stumbled back toward the car, but it felt like we were moving in circles. The structure faded behind us, lost in the swirling mists. The voice followed us, always just beyond reach. Eventually, we found ourselves back at the car, and something inside told me we shouldn't get in. But we did. As soon as the doors shut, the fog receded slightly. We could see the road again, though it stretched endlessly, vanishing into the horizon. The drive was long, and the silence oppressive. We didn't speak much. None of us could shake the feeling of being watched, as if the fog had followed us, waiting just out of sight. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night. All I know is that something wasn't right, and I pray we never cross paths with whatever it was again. I never believed in the old tales they told about the abandoned factory. It was a relic of the past, a place everyone in town seemed to avoid. Rumors of shadows, whispers, and things that went bump in the night had always seemed like just that. Rumors. But I was never one to fear the unknown, at least not until that night. I had always heard stories from my parents and older folks about the factory, how it had been shut down decades ago after a series of strange occurrences, machinery running on its own, lights flickering and whispers echoing through the empty halls. But no one I knew had actually dared to enter it until that night. It was a few weeks after the factory officially closed down for good, and curiosity got the better of me. A few friends and I decided to explore. The building was towering, windows shattered, rusted beams sagging. The front doors creaked as we pushed them open, the air inside heavy with the scent of decay. We stepped cautiously through the dimly lit corridors, flashlight beams cutting through the thick shadows. We wandered through empty hallways filled with old machinery, cracked concrete, and scattered bits of broken equipment. It was like walking through the echoes of the past. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. I started feeling like we were being watched. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was just the echoes of our own footsteps. We stopped in what once must have been a break room. A long, faded table sat in the center, surrounded by chairs that looked like they hadn't been used in years. The silence in the room was oppressive. I could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above us, barely hanging on. That's when it started. The faint whispering. It was so soft at first, barely audible, like someone was talking just on the edge of hearing. I froze, trying to make sense of it, but the others didn't seem to notice. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind, the old building settling, but the whispers didn't fade. If anything, they grew louder, more distinct. I took a step toward the hallway, my friends still gathered around the table. The whispers were clearer now, and they sounded wrong. It was like they weren't coming from anywhere. The words were faint, but they seemed to be repeating the same thing over and over, like a distorted echo. Leave. 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 I tried to call out to my friends, but the words caught in my throat. My flashlight flickered, then died completely. Panic gripped me as I scrambled to replace the batteries, but my hands were trembling so badly I could barely manage. "Guys," I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." I heard a low, raspy laugh behind me, cold and hollow. My blood ran cold. I turned around slowly, expecting to see one of my friends, but there was no one there. The whispers had stopped, but the air grew colder. I could feel a presence in the room now, something that wasn't human. I heard it then. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward me from the hall. They weren't my friends' footsteps. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The sound grew louder, closer, until I could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath me. I backed away, stepping carefully until I felt the wall press against my back. The whispers returned, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of dragging footsteps. "Leave. Leave. Leave," they seemed to chant, their distorted voices weaving into the air. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. Suddenly, the lights went out entirely, plunging the room into total darkness. My friends' voices echoed faintly, calling out for me from deeper in the building, but I couldn't find them. I fumbled with my phone, but it was dead. The only sound now was the relentless whispering, growing louder, more urgent. I held my breath, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows, but nothing ever did. Somehow, I found my way out, back through the winding halls, past the echoes of those whispers. My friends never believed me when I told them. To this day, they think I imagined it, that it was just some old factory with nothing more than dust and creaking metal. But I know what I heard, and sometimes, even now, I can still hear the whispers, just faint enough to make my skin crawl. The day had been perfect. We set out in the early afternoon to visit a small, desolate lake hidden deep in the hills. It wasn't a place anyone went often. Locals didn't talk about it much. My friends and I had stumbled upon it once before during a hike, and something about the isolation drew us back. The drive was long and winding, and by the time we arrived, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. The lake was peaceful, the water shimmering under the fading light. We were the only ones there, and it felt like our own private sanctuary. We unpacked our things, set up our chairs, and cracked open a few beers. The air was still and cool, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The silence wasn't natural. There was a kind of tension in the air that made the back of my neck prickle. I shrugged it off, assuming I was just imagining things. We spent a few hours lounging by the water, laughing, talking about nothing in particular. The stillness of the lake seemed to stretch endlessly in front of us, but with each passing hour, the quiet felt less like a serene escape and more like something was watching from beyond. It wasn't until the sun had fully set that things began to feel wrong. The faintest whisper of a breeze started stirring the surface of the water, creating ripples that seemed to echo far too loudly in the quiet. The shadows stretched longer, and we started to hear distant noises. Something scraping, dragging, far in the woods. My friends didn't seem bothered, but I felt my stomach knot. I tried to dismiss the feeling as nerves from being so isolated, but something in the air felt wrong. Every so often I'd glance toward the tree line, expecting to see someone or something. But there was nothing. Just trees, silent and still. As the last bit of light faded, we all decided it was time to head back. The trip back was uneventful, and we didn't talk much. The tension between us palpable. It wasn't until we were far away from the lake that things got truly strange. That's when my phone buzzed. A text popped up. "I'm still there." I froze. My heart began to pound as I looked around the car. No one else had mentioned anything about sending a text. I quickly unlocked my phone to check who it was from. The message wasn't from any of my friends. It was a number I didn't recognize. "I'm still there," it read again. My breath hitched as I realized the sender wasn't just talking about the lake. They were still there. I looked out the window, my eyes scanning the dark fields and forests rushing past. But there was no one. No car following us. No signs of movement. Just the empty, winding road. My phone buzzed once more, and this time the message read, "I've been following you since the lake." I clenched the steering wheel tighter. My mind raced. I wanted to believe it was some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. My friends hadn't received any message like that. No one could have known we were at the lake. We pulled over at a small, desolate gas station on the edge of town. The place was eerily quiet, and the flickering neon sign seemed to reflect the same unsettling silence from earlier. I stepped out, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia, but the world outside felt off. As I filled the gas tank, I kept glancing back toward the car, waiting for something. Anything. A noise from behind made me whip around. Nothing. but I could swear someone was watching from the darkened edge of the forest. Their shadows stretched impossibly long under the gas station's weak lights. I hurried back to the car, my phone gripped tightly in my hand. As I slid into the driver's seat, my heart skipped a beat when the screen lit up again. I'm still here. This time, the message came with a photo, one of the lake. But it wasn't the peaceful image we remembered. The water was dark, and in the distance, barely visible in the fading light, something moved, something tall and unnatural. The last message followed. I'll be with you, always. I never looked back as I drove. I couldn't. I've always loved the forest. There's something about being surrounded by towering trees, the fresh air, and the quiet that draws me in. So, when my friends suggested a weekend camping trip deep into the woods, I didn't hesitate. It sounded perfect, peaceful, serene, just what we needed to escape from the chaos of city life. We packed up our gear, grabbed some supplies, and hiked several miles into the heart of the forest. The trail was narrow, winding, and covered in fallen leaves, but the scenery was breathtaking. As we set up camp, I remember how quiet everything felt. No distant sounds of cars, no faint hum of electricity, just us and the wilderness. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat around, laughing and enjoying each other's company. I had never felt more at peace. But when we decided to turn in, something shifted. That night, I kept waking up, hearing strange noises just beyond the trees. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the occasional hoot of an owl. These were softer, quieter sounds, almost like whispers. I brushed them off at first, telling myself it was just the wind, but something about the tone of those whispers felt wrong. Intimate, almost as though they were meant for someone, not just the forest. The second night, things felt different. I couldn't sleep at all. The forest had gone silent. Not the kind of silence you're used to when you're out in nature, but an unnatural, almost oppressive quiet. There wasn't a single sound from any creature. No crickets, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. It was as if the forest had been drained of all life. At one point, I decided to step out of the tent and check the surroundings. The air was thick, almost suffocating. I shone my flashlight into the woods, expecting to see some critters or movement, but there was nothing. Just darkness. I called out to my friends, but my voice felt swallowed by the stillness. Then I saw it. Something standing far off, just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't a person, at least not a normal one. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and it didn't move like a human. Its silhouette was dark, almost blending into the night, but the more I stared, the more I felt like its presence was wrong. The air seemed to pulse around it, and I swear I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. I froze, my breath hitching. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It didn't seem curious. It didn't feel human. It felt watchful in a way that made my skin crawl. I backed away, slowly retreating into the tent, my heart racing. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made me flinch, but nothing else came. The next morning, my friends were awake, laughing, acting like nothing had happened. They didn't hear the whispers, didn't see the figure in the woods. When I told them, they just shrugged it off, calling me paranoid. I didn't press the issue. We packed up our gear, leaving the quiet forest behind us, still unsure of what we'd encountered. It wasn't until we were back in town that I realized something truly terrifying. I checked my phone. No service, as expected. But when I scrolled through my pictures from the trip, I froze at what I found. In the photos from the night before, something appeared. A faint, shadowy figure standing among the trees, barely visible but unmistakably there. It wasn't just a trick of the light or my imagination. It was real. And somehow, whatever it was, it had been watching us. I don't know what it wanted, and I never want to go back to that place. Some things are better left unseen. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been a logical thinker, someone who dismissed old tales and rumors as nothing more than silly distractions. That changed one night on a solitary trip to the old family lake house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cabin tucked deep in the woods by a quiet, remote lake. My family used to go there when I was a kid, but we hadn't been back in years. After hearing it was in rough shape, I decided to check it out one weekend, just to make sure everything was still standing. The drive took longer than I remembered, the road winding through dense forest that swallowed any light from the moon. The lake house itself was hidden from view until you were nearly upon it. It stood there, dark and silent, its windows covered in grime and cobwebs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed inside. The interior was in worse condition than I expected. Dust and mold covered everything. Cobwebs hung like torn curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked under every step. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, though I wasn't sure if that was going to help with the oppressive silence. That evening, after checking for any signs of wildlife, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the trees in a perfect mirror, but the air had a strange stillness to it, as if something had been watching and waiting for me to arrive. As night fell, I made a fire outside, sitting by the lake to enjoy the peace. The crackling flames didn't do much to comfort me, though. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing as the minutes passed. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible but persistent, carried on the wind. I froze, listening, my skin crawling. The whispers didn't come from any particular direction but seemed to be all around me. I stood, heart racing, and scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. The silence returned. But the unease wouldn't go away. I convinced myself it was just the wind, some sound that had traveled from miles away and got distorted in the stillness. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, the sound of my own breath echoing in the empty cabin. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by strange dreams. I kept waking up, feeling like something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. Each time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than before. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the lake. The sun was bright, the forest alive with birdsong, but something still felt off. As I walked, I found old, faded footprints in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't mine. They looked much older, but perfectly preserved in the soft ground. I kept walking, pushing away the growing sense of dread. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading from the cabin, circling around the lake. But not just a few. The footprints stretched as far as I could see, as if something had been walking these woods for years. I turned back towards the cabin, but before I could make it, I saw something by the water's edge. A figure stood there, just beyond the trees, its form indistinct, its face obscured by shadows. I froze, unable to move as I stared at it. It wasn't human. Not really. The figure's shape was wrong, its posture unnatural, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. Panic set in as I realized it was watching me, tilting its head as if studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from inside my head. Leave, leave, leave. The whisper repeated itself, growing louder, closer, until I couldn't tell if it was real or in my head. I turned to run, but the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I spent the rest of the day packing up and preparing to leave. The whispers never stopped. They echoed in my head long after I was back in my car, long after I was miles away from that place. To this day, I haven't been able to forget that trip. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can still hear those whispers. Not out loud, but in my mind, like they're waiting. always watching. I never thought a simple trip to the library could haunt me like that. It was an ordinary evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I had just finished dinner and decided to visit the library downtown. I'd always loved the quiet, the smell of old books, the calmness of the place. It was something I did regularly, but that night felt different. The library was quiet, like usual, with only a few people scattered around, their heads buried in books or computers. I liked the peaceful hum of pages turning and the faint sound of the old fluorescent lights buzzing above. It felt like time moved slower there. I spent the evening reading, drifting through the stacks until I found myself in the back of the building. That's where the old section was, filled with dusty aged books no one really touched. It was peaceful, almost serene. But something was off. I remember feeling like I was being watched. The feeling started slowly, creeping up on me. I dismissed it at first, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, a faint whispering. I turned, looking around, but there was no one there. The whispering continued, just soft enough that I couldn't make out the words. It was almost as if someone was speaking right next to my ear, but nothing was there. I tried to ignore it, convinced I was imagining things. Still, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I decided to leave, but as I passed the long row of bookshelves, I noticed something strange. At the end of the row stood a figure, tall and thin, just standing there in the dim light. Its face was obscured by the shadow, but its posture was unnervingly unnatural, like it wasn't quite human. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I blinked, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, but when I looked again, the figure hadn't moved. My legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't look away. There was something about it that didn't belong, something wrong. Then, in a voice that wasn't human, it whispered my name, soft but chilling. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the figure. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and tried to yell for help, but the sound got caught in my throat. Suddenly, the figure turned and disappeared between the rows of books. I stood there, frozen, unsure whether I had imagined it or not. The whispering continued, though fainter now, as though it were coming from within the very walls of the library. I rushed to the entrance, clutching my phone tightly in my hand. I couldn't leave fast enough. As I pushed open the heavy doors, I glanced back one last time. The library was still. Too still. The buzzing fluorescent lights flickered once before dying out, plunging the building into darkness. I never went back to that library. To this day, I don't know if what I saw was real, but the whispering still lingers in the back of my mind, and I'll never forget the figure that vanished between the rows of books. I had always loved taking long drives. There was something peaceful about winding roads and open landscapes, a way to clear my head and escape from the chaos of everyday life. One evening, after a particularly long and stressful week, I decided to take a spontaneous trip out into the countryside. The sun was setting as I pulled onto a narrow, winding road surrounded by forests on either side. The world felt silent, distant, almost untouched by time. I had no destination in mind, just the freedom of the open road. As I drove deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around me. The shadows grew darker, stretching long and menacing across the pavement. It was almost as if the forest itself was watching. I had the strange feeling that I was being pulled further into some unseen force. I passed a few old, crumbling signs for landmarks that no longer existed. The further I went, the less familiar everything became. The road twisted and turned, the forest thickening around me, swallowing any sense of direction or familiarity. That's when I saw her. At least, I think it was her. A figure, standing motionless by the side of the road. She was wearing a long, flowing white dress, her dark hair hanging over her shoulders. Her eyes were hollow, empty, as she stared straight ahead, not moving. I slowed down as I approached, unable to look away. My heart pounded as I passed by her, but something felt off. I glanced back in my rear-view mirror. She wasn't there anymore. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, empty and desolate. I shook my head, trying to brush off the lingering feeling of unease. Maybe I was imagining things, but something about that figure felt wrong. As I continued driving, I came to a sudden realization. I had no idea where I was. The road had changed. It wasn't just winding anymore. It felt like I was on a loop, repeating the same stretch of forest over and over. My panic grew as I pressed harder on the accelerator, hoping to break free from this endless cycle of trees. Then I noticed something strange. Lights. Not from my car, but from deep within the forest. Flickering, distant, like someone was trying to signal to me. I couldn't stop myself. I followed the faint glow deeper into the woods. The light grew brighter, and soon I could see a figure moving towards me. It wasn't the woman from before. This figure was taller, obscured by the thick shadows, but its eyes seemed to shine like dark pools. The closer I got, the harder it was to focus. The light was almost blinding now, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. The figure stepped into view, and I realized whatever this was wasn't human. Its face was distorted, twisted into something that wasn't quite alive. No features, no expression, just an abyss of darkness where its eyes should have been. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, only the oppressive silence of the forest. Panic took over, but my body refused to move. I wanted to look away, to turn the car around and drive back, but my gaze was locked on the creature. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure disappeared. The light faded, leaving me in the same endless darkness. I knew I couldn't stay. I spun my car around, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I drove as fast as I could, barely noticing the trees passing by, the landscape a blur of black and gray. Hours later, I found myself back on a familiar highway, far from the forest. My hands still trembled, and the weight of what I had seen pressed heavily on my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a trick of the mind, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I've never gone back to that stretch of road, and I never will. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. It was the kind of evening where the sky seemed to press down on everything, as if it wanted to swallow the world whole. My friends and I had decided to take a drive out to the old abandoned lighthouse, miles from any town, where the cliffs stretched out over the ocean like they were reaching toward the sky itself. The lighthouse had been shut down decades ago, long before anyone could remember. We'd heard rumors that it was haunted, but we didn't believe in that kind of stuff. We just wanted an adventure. The road to get there was narrow, winding, and barely lit by a few flickering streetlights that flickered on and off like they were uncertain of their own purpose. We parked the car at the base of the cliffs and began walking toward the lighthouse. The air smelled of salt and decay, the kind of place where you feel like you've stepped out of time. The lighthouse stood there, looming and skeletal against the darkening sky. Its red brick tower stood like a sentinel, long forgotten, its windows cracked and covered in moss. We reached the entrance, a heavy metal door that creaked open with a groan. Inside, everything was covered in dust. The old lanterns hung from the walls, cobwebs stretched between them. The faint smell of mildew and dampness clung to everything. We walked up the narrow staircase, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The higher we climbed, the darker it got. The dim light from the lanterns barely illuminated our path. I kept expecting to hear something. Footsteps, whispers, or maybe the creak of an old floorboard. Something to break the silence. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, and the soft shuffle of my friends behind me. Finally, we reached the top. The door at the top of the staircase creaked open, and we stepped out onto the balcony of the lighthouse. The wind hit us, sharp and cold. As we looked out over the cliffs, the ocean stretched out endlessly beneath us. The waves crashed far below, their roar distant and faint. The horizon stretched into nothingness, the darkness blending with the sea. We stood there, taking in the view, laughing and joking. We were miles from civilization, miles from anything that could disturb us. Or so we thought. That's when I heard it. The soft scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor below us. I turned to my friends, but they didn't seem to hear it. I figured it was the wind, some old creaking of the lighthouse settling into the darkness. But then it came again, louder, more deliberate. This time, it wasn't below us. It was above. I froze, staring up toward the narrow spiral staircase that led to the top of the tower. The scraping noise was now followed by the faint sound of ragged breathing, labored and slow, like something struggling to draw in air. My hands trembled as I pointed upward. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but my voice was lost in the wind. My friends looked at me, puzzled. I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on my mind. But then came the unmistakable sound of a voice, low and cracked, whispering something I couldn't make out. We were alone up there. I knew it. The others insisted it was probably the wind or some animal, but my instincts told me otherwise. I grabbed my friend's arm and whispered, "We need to get out of here." We turned, bolting down the staircase as fast as we could, the sound of our footsteps pounding in our ears. The scraping noise followed us, but it was closer now, louder. It sounded like it was climbing after us. When we reached the base of the tower, the door was still open, but what we saw outside wasn't normal. There was something standing by the car, something too tall, too thin, with its back bent unnaturally. It didn't move like a person. It was more like a shadow, stretching toward us in the dim light. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow, dark, and seemed to burn with a cold, inhuman light. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The others were frozen in place, too terrified to move. The figure turned its head slowly as if observing us, and then started to walk toward us. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it wasn't sure what it wanted. Without thinking, we bolted down the cliffside, the figure still behind us. The wind howled louder, but we didn't stop. We didn't stop until we reached the car and drove away, not looking back. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I haven't been able to go near that lighthouse since. Whatever was up there, waiting for us, still lingers in my mind. Some places, I've learned, are better left untouched. It was just a normal Sunday afternoon, and I had decided to take a long drive out to the outskirts of town. The weather was crisp and clear, the kind of day that makes you want to get away from the noise of the city. I hadn't been out this way before, but something about the empty roads and open fields had always called to me. I drove down winding country roads, surrounded by endless fields of tall grass. It was so quiet that the only sounds were the hum of the car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The air smelled fresh, and for once there was no one around. I appreciated the peace, letting my mind wander. As I drove, I noticed an old barn sitting off in the distance. It wasn't much, just a weathered wooden structure surrounded by overgrown weeds, but something about it tugged at me. I couldn't quite explain why, but I felt an inexplicable pull toward it. So I decided to take a detour, leaving the main road behind. When I parked and stepped out of the car, the silence was overwhelming. It wasn't a comforting silence, though. It felt oppressive, as if the very earth was holding its breath. I approached the barn cautiously. The wood creaked beneath my feet as I made my way closer. The door hung open slightly, swinging faintly in the breeze. I hesitated but stepped inside. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint slivers of sunlight that managed to filter through cracks in the old wood. The place smelled like damp hay and decay. My footsteps echoed, the sound amplified in the stillness. The barn wasn't empty. In the far corner, partially hidden by shadows, stood something tall and thin, I wasn't sure what it was. At first, I thought it was just old farm equipment or debris. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't. It wasn't human, but neither was it entirely unfamiliar. Its form was elongated, with arms that seemed too long, bending unnaturally. Its face, if you could call it that, was hollow and void. No features to speak of, just a black void where the eyes should have been. It stood completely still, like a statue, as if waiting. My heart raced. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't move. It felt like the barn had shifted, trapping me in a place with some unseen force. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It simply stood there, watching. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice in the way we think of it. It was more of a whispering thought that seemed to echo inside my own head. "Why are you here?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The barn door creaked louder, and I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. The oppressive silence returned, but now there was something else. Something watching. The figure in the corner shifted, just slightly, as if it had taken a step toward me. My legs finally moved, carrying me in a frantic stumble toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I looked back, catching a glimpse of something in the shadows. It wasn't just the figure now. There were more, a dozen, maybe more, standing motionless in the dark corners of the barn, all watching me with those empty voids for eyes. I couldn't escape them. The door wouldn't open. I turned back, heart pounding, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The barn felt like it was closing in, folding around me. Then I saw it, the face of one of them, so close now. It was right in front of me, and still it didn't have eyes, just a featureless black void. And yet, I felt it staring deep into me, past my skin and into my soul. The whisper came again. Louder now. "Why are you here?" This time, I heard my own voice answer, trembling and weak. I don't know, but I did know. I knew something had been waiting for me. It wanted something I couldn't understand. In that moment, I realized that leaving the barn wasn't an option, and neither was forgetting.